Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome back to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight begins our peaceful journey through the Hanoverian Dynasty, a royal saga that shaped the heart of Britain from 1714 to 1901. In part 1, we'll softly explore the early reigns of George I, George II, and George III, from a king who barely spoke English to a monarch who led men into battle, to a ruler who witnessed revolution, empire, and the rise of industry, all while facing his own private battles. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these soft whispers from the past lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Tap like, drop a gentle comment, and subscribe to keep the calm flowing. George, later known as King George I, was born on May 28, 1660, in Hanover, a bustling city in north-central Germany, part of the Duchy of Brunswick-Lüneburg. His father, Ernest Augustus, was the big-shot Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg, and his mother, Sophia of the Palatinate, came from a powerful family tied to Europe's top dynasties. Their marriage and George's upbringing set the stage for his complex journey to power, as we'll dive into below. His father, Ernest Augustus, held the title of Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg. Over time, he gained additional titles, including Prince Bishop of Osnabrück and, most significantly, Prince Elector of Hanover in 1692, a prestigious role within the Holy Roman Empire. George's mother, Sophia of the Palatinate, hailed from a prominent principality controlling much of Western Germany along the Rhine River. She was connected to many of Europe's leading dynasties, particularly in England, Scotland, and Ireland. Her 1658 marriage to Ernest Augustus was politically motivated, strengthening ties to families like the Danish royals, to whom Ernest Augustus was related. George was their firstborn, followed by 6 siblings, 5 boys and 1 girl, Sophia Charlotte, who later became Queen of Prussia through marriage. The younger sons pursued military paths, as they were unlikely to inherit Hanoverian titles, though George had a rivalry with his next brother, Frederick Augustus. Born in 1661, Frederick Augustus had a realistic chance for much of his life to inherit some Hanoverian territories as primogeniture, where the eldest son or daughter, if no sons existed, inherited the entire estate, was not yet legally fixed in Hanover during the late 17th century, a remnant of medieval times when lands were often split among sons. Hanover's succession politics were not the only complexity at George's birth. Germany was a tangled mosaic of political units. In the High Middle Ages and late medieval period, it comprised hundreds of entities, from large duchies, margravats, principalities, and counties, to small free cities and territories. Many bishops and ecclesiastical lords governed small states too. These were loosely united under the Holy Roman Empire, with an emperor chosen by 7 electors from the most powerful German states, though by the 17th century, the imperial title was effectively hereditary for the Austrian Habsburgs. A consolidation process had begun in the 16th and 17th centuries, with larger states absorbing smaller ones. Still, over 100 German states existed when George was born. The Duchy of Brunswick-Lüneburg was among the larger ones, placing George in a family of significant influence in 17th century Germany. Adding to the complexity, some states were Lutheran, others Roman Catholic, and some followed the Reformed or Calvinist branch of Protestantism. These religious divides fueled a century and a half of tension in Central Europe after the Protestant Reformation. When George was born in 1660, the Holy Roman Empire was still reeling from the 30 Years' War, 1618-1648, which devastated Germany as the Austrian Habsburgs failed to impose Catholicism across Central Europe. By all accounts, George's childhood was relatively joyful. His mother was unusually affectionate for the high aristocracy, doting on him and his siblings. Though not the favorite, George was seen as a dutiful, serious, and responsible eldest child, qualities essential for a political heir. He was educated by the household's governor and receptor until age 15 in 1675, mastering German, French, and Latin. His early passions were hunting and riding, activities he shared with his father. In 1675, when his formal education concluded, he began a military career, campaigning with his father against the French, alongside the Dutch in the Franco-Dutch War. George fought at the Battle of Conza Brücke in late summer 1675 and participated in campaigns in 1676 and 1677. In 1679, he received the title of Duke of Hanover, marking his status as his father's primary heir. In 1680, he visited England's King Charles II's court and spent time at Oxford, where he received an honorary degree. It's debated whether marriage talks occurred for George to wed Charles's niece, Anne, but if so, they led nowhere. Back in Germany, a marriage was arranged with his first cousin, Sophia Dorothea, daughter of his uncle Georg William. This union aimed to prevent the division of family lands and secure George's financial future by uniting Hanover with the Celle territories his uncle controlled. It was not an ideal foundation for marriage and later ended tragically. They wed in November 1682, with George aged 22 and Sophia Dorothea 16. Their son, George Ludwig, was born almost exactly a year later. Their second child, a daughter named Sophia Dorothea after her mother, arrived in 1687. Years later, she married Prince Frederick William I of Prussia, producing a son, Frederick, who became Frederick II, known as Frederick the Great, making George his grandfather, and linking him to Prussia's rise as a major European power in the 18th century. Soon after his marriage, George was involved in a pivotal yet often overlooked event in early modern European history. Since the late 14th century, the Ottoman Turks had expanded across the Balkans, Levant, and North Africa, controlling much of the Mediterranean. By the 1520s, they held most of Hungary and parts of the Carpathian Basin. In 1683, Ottoman Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha besieged Vienna with 150,000 troops, aiming to seize it from the Austrian Habsburgs. The city was vulnerable, but a coalition of Christian states, led by John III Sobieski of Poland and Lithuania, intervened. Hanover contributed, and George fought in the Battle of Vienna on September 12, 1683, a Christian victory that halted Ottoman expansion into Central Europe. George and his brothers continued periodic campaigns against the Turks, as Christian states sought to push back the Ottoman Empire and secure Vienna. In 1791, Frederick was killed in one such campaign. By then, the chance of splitting Hanover's lands with George had vanished. In the mid-1680s, their father declared that Hanover would adopt primogeniture, ensuring all lands passed to George upon his death, assuming he outlived his father, a late decision compared to other European powers. Shortly after Frederick's death, the political weight of George's future inheritance grew. Since the mid-14th century, the Holy Roman Empire typically had 7 prince-electors who chose the emperor. These were the King of Bohemia, Duke of Saxony, Margrave of Brandenburg, Count Palatine of the Rhine, and the Prince-Archbishops of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier. During the 30 Years' War, the Count Palatine was briefly replaced by the Duke of Bavaria for loyalty to the Habsburgs. After the war, the Count Palatine was restored, making 8 electors, which risked voting deadlocks. Calls for a 9th elector grew, especially after 1685, when Catholic Philip William of Neuburg became Count Palatine, disrupting the electoral college's religious balance. In 1692, George's father was named the 9th Prince-Elector, the Elector of Hanover, a title George would inherit, cementing his status as a key political heir in Central Europe. By the time his father became elector, a scandal was brewing in Hanover. George's marriage to Sophia Dorothea was never warm, and by the late 1680s, his prolonged absences campaigning against the Turks worsened their estrangement. By the early 1690s, their indifference turned to contempt. In 1691, George took a mistress, Erengard Melusine von der Schulenberg, with whom he had 3 illegitimate daughters, the first born in January 1692. Sophia Dorothea began an affair in 1692 with Philip Christoph von Königsmarck, a Swedish noble and Hanoverian army officer. Their indiscretion caused a scandal by 1694, leading to von Königsmarck's murder by courtiers that summer. George was not directly involved, but may have known of the plan. Months later, Sophia refused to live with George, and their marriage was dissolved. She was confined to Alden House in Lüneburg, effectively imprisoned for the next 3 decades until her death in 1726. Her role in subsequent Hanoverian conspiracies did little to help her case. George maintained his relationship with Melusine for life without marrying her, and had other mistresses periodically. In his late 20s, events in England, hundreds of kilometers west, began unfolding that would profoundly shape George's later life and his descendants' futures. In 1685, King Charles II of England, Scotland, and Ireland had died without a legitimate heir, despite siring over a dozen illegitimate children. He was succeeded by his brother, James, Duke of York. The accession of King James II was very problematic, as he was a Roman Catholic in a country which had become staunchly Protestant over the previous century and a half. It wasn't long before his heavy-handed manner of governing and his religion led to a coup, and in 1688, the Glorious Revolution occurred. Through this, James was deposed in favor of his Protestant daughter, Mary, and her Dutch husband, William of Orange. Mary II and William III did not have any children, and so following Mary's death in 1694 and William's in 1702, the throne passed to Mary's sister, Queen Anne I. Anne's accession did not hold out the prospect of a simple line of succession either. Though having numerous children and being pregnant 14 times at least, Anne had a brutal natal history, and virtually all of her children had been lost during pregnancy or died before reaching their second birthday. In the summer of 1700, her only remaining child, 11-year-old Prince William, died. There was now no clear successor to Anne in the eyes of England's Protestants, who refused to countenance the possibility of old King James's Catholic son, who lived in exile in France, succeeding Anne one day. All of this had implications for George, as the House of Hanover was related to the English royal house of Stuart. George was the great-grandson of King James I, who had ruled England between 1603 and 1625. James had a daughter named Elizabeth, who, in 1613, had married Frederick V, the Elector Palatine, who ruled over a large German principality along the River Rhine. One of their children, born in the autumn of 1630, was none other than George's mother, Sophia. As such, George had a claim to the English throne, one which was further solidified in 1701 when the English Parliament passed an Act of Settlement that legally prohibited any Roman Catholic from succeeding to the throne of England, a measure designed to block the Catholic branch of the House of Stuart from resuming the throne once Anne died. With this, it became clear that George might be the most likely successor to Anne. There was precedent for a foreigner succeeding to the English throne in this way. After all, George's great-grandfather, King James I, was a Scotsman who had succeeded to the English throne back in 1603 by right of being the great-great-grandson of King Henry VII of England, the founder of the Tudor dynasty back in 1485. George's father died in late January 1698. With that, George ascended as Prince Elector of Hanover at 37 years of age, and with the associated titles of Duke of Brunswick-Luneburg and Prince Bishop of Osnabrück. Over the next decade and a half, much of his focus would be on the War of the Spanish Succession, through which a grand alliance of Britain, Austria, the Dutch Republic, and smaller German states such as Hanover sought to prevent a member of the French royal family from succeeding to the Spanish throne, following the extinction of the direct Habsburg royal line there in 1700, when King Charles II died. Hanover was one of the more minor players in the war, which was waged from 1701 down to 1714, though still an important partner of the British, fighting against some of the pro-French German states, such as Bavaria and Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel. Throughout it, George was an active war leader, campaigning himself in person during most campaigns. His qualities as a general were considerable, and in 1707, he was offered the position of Imperial Field Marshal within the Holy Roman Empire. In the end, Hanover was one of the few states that emerged well out of the war after sheer exhaustion led to peace treaties being signed in 1713 and 1714, with its position as the ninth elector of the Holy Roman Empire acknowledged by all parties, and some lands gained at the expense of its smaller neighbours like Wolfenbüttel. Another of the main issues which would come to concern George in his time as Elector of Hanover was the Great Northern War. In the 16th century, numerous powers had emerged in northern and eastern Europe that became rivals for dominance of the Baltic Sea and the Baltic States region around modern-day Lithuania, Estonia and Latvia. The three main players were the Kingdom of Sweden, Tsarist Russia, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, with the dual monarchy of Denmark-Norway also playing a part and some of the smaller North German states being dragged into the conflicts. Occasionally, wars had periodically occurred. They were all eclipsed, though, by the clash which broke out in 1700. The Great Northern War was launched by Peter the Great of Russia in an effort to end Sweden's dominance of the Baltic Sea and to acquire a Baltic seaport for Russia, the region around modern-day St. Petersburg being controlled by Sweden at that time. Russia found allies in Warsaw and Copenhagen amongst the Poles, Lithuanians and Danes, while numerous other powers would be pulled in from time to time from around Europe in a clash that would last 21 years. George was always sympathetic towards the Russian cause. In appraising this position, one needs to consider that Sweden, in the 17th century, had taken control of much of the Baltic coastline of northern Germany, around Mecklenburg eastwards into Pomerania. With Hanover's lands lying just to the south, anything which weakened the Swedes could potentially be in Hanover's interests. Consequently, George informally allied himself with Russia, the Poles, and the Danes, though he did not enter the war for many years. Indeed, Russian victory at the Battle of Poltava in 1709 seemed to have brought the war to an end in Swedish defeat. But in 1715, King Charles X of Sweden returned home after years in exile and reignited the conflict. At this juncture, George decided to enter the war fully on the side of Russia and Peter the Great's other allies, hoping to gain land in the eventual peace negotiations. In the years that followed, George contributed tens of thousands of troops towards the war in northern Europe, as Charles X tried to re-establish Swedish dominance over the Baltic and to conquer Norway from the Danes. His death at the siege of Fredriksten in November 1718 ended matters for the most part, and the new Swedish government quickly sought to bring the Great Northern War to an end. George benefited immensely from the difficult position the Swedes were in, and through the Treaty of Stockholm, signed in November 1719, his negotiators secured the duchies of Bremen and Verden in northern Germany as the spoils of war for all. Of the time that Hanoverian troops were fighting the Swedes, George was directing their activities from England rather than Germany. On the 1st of August 1714, George's cousin, Queen Anne, died. Her death came 8 weeks after that of George's own mother, Sophia, at 83 years of age. Hence, the way was cleared for George to succeed Anne as King of Britain and Ireland. Extensive measures had been put in place before Anne ever died to prepare for the succession of the House of Hanover and to avoid the Catholic son of the deposed King James II in France from trying to pursue his claim to the throne. Thus, in an age before telecommunications of any kind, George had already been proclaimed as the King of Britain and Ireland in London, long before he even knew that Anne was dead. It would be days before he learned of the events, and then it took several weeks for the preparations to be made for him to travel to England and to enter London as the new monarch. Subtle signs of his accession were seen in the royal documentation associated with the succession, the new king signing documents with the anglicised version of his name, George, with an E, rather than the German Georg without. An E within days of ascending to the throne. George landed at Greenwich near London on the 18th of September 1714 with a large party of German nobles and courtiers, including his mistress and his children. 2 days later, the royal party entered London around midday, the procession proceeding slowly through the capital over a course of several hours, so that the over 500,000 inhabitants of the city had a chance to see their new monarch in an age when the physical presence of the king and his image on coins were the only real mechanisms for projecting royal power into the public domain. All told, it was a fairly seamless succession, given the variables involved and the threat of the plans being destabilized in a country where many people were distinctly unhappy with the idea of a German dynasty ascending as the royal family, no matter their relation to the House of Stuart. Matters were not helped by the fact that George arrived in England unable to speak the language of his subjects, although he could converse in French with many people in government, and with the nobility, as this was the lingua franca of European court society in the 17th and 18th centuries. Nevertheless, it was not a good look for a man who was either fully or partially proficient in German, French, Latin, Dutch, and Italian, to have not bothered to begin learning English years earlier in expectation of becoming King of Britain. While the Hanoverian succession had been effected with few problems in London when George and his court arrived there in September, the signs of discontent were more tangible elsewhere. Riots and public disorder offences rose in the weeks that followed George's arrival in England in cities and towns across the country, peaking on the 20th of October, the day of the new king's coronation at Westminster, a service which was normally carried out in English, but which was celebrated in Latin so that George and his courtiers from Germany could understand what was being said. As undesirable as the riots were, they paled in significance to what occurred north of the border in Scotland. Tensions were still running high in Scotland in 1714, as a result of the 1707 Act of Union, which had joined the monarchies of England and Scotland into the new entity of Great Britain, and had brought the Scottish Parliament to an end as well. In the months following the accession, many nobles there, led by the Earl of Mar, began plotting to restore the House of Stuart by declaring their support for James II's son, James Edward Stuart. In August 1715, they launched a short-lived rebellion in the Scottish Highlands. It proved relatively easy to suppress it by the end of the year, though corresponding revolts had been planned in Scotland and in parts of England around Bristol and along the southern ports. Had the Jacobite uprising been better planned, and had the Dutch not sent thousands of troops to Britain on short notice to honour the terms of a treaty signed with the English government in Anne's time, through which they had promised to aid in ensuring that George ascended to the throne smoothly, things could have played out very differently. As it was, George's regime survived this initial scare quite easily. The political system in the country George had arrived to rule was substantially different from what he was used to in Hanover. Hanover was still an autocratic principality, where the Elector Prince ruled in association with ministers and bureaucrats that he selected personally. Britain, by way of contrast, was already well along the way to becoming a fully fledged modern constitutional monarchy. The civil wars of the 1640s and the Glorious Revolution of 1688 had reduced the power of the monarchy and strengthened Parliament, the latter of which was a nearly permanently sitting body that governed the nation and its affairs. The senior officers of state, however, were still picked by the monarch, rather than being elected, though they had to command some parliamentary support to remain in office. While nearly all of these constitutional changes had occurred during the Stuart era, George had his own place in British political history in being the monarch under whom the concept of a modern prime minister emerged. In the late 1710s, he came under increasing pressure from the parliamentary House of Commons to appoint Robert Walpole, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, as the head of the administration. George was not initially favourable to the idea. Nevertheless, following a financial crisis in 1720, he eventually capitulated, and Walpole became the de facto Prime Minister of Britain in 1721. He would hold that office for the next 21 years until 1742, becoming the longest-serving Prime Minister in British history, as well as the first. While Walpole did dominate the government from 1721 onwards, George was not averse to playing some role in British political affairs. He had demonstrated this in 1717 when he pushed for the agreement known as the Triple Alliance. This was agreed between Britain, the Dutch Republic and France, and was a major reorientation of European politics. For decades since the Franco-Dutch War broke out in 1672, England and the Dutch had generally been in conflict with France. The death of King Louis XIV in 1715 opened the way for realignment in such a way that would prevent the near-constant state of war that had existed between 1672 and 1714, with the Franco-Dutch War, the 9 Years' War, and the War of the Spanish. Succession having mired Western and Central Europe in conflict for 28 of those 42 years. The alliance was also formed as a means of signalling to Spain, which felt betrayed by the losses it had sustained at the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, not to seek a new war with the hope of French aid. The Triple Alliance of 1717 was more of a non-aggression pact than a full military alliance, but it was effective all the same. In contrast to his time as Elector of Hanover, George's reign as King of Great Britain was markedly peaceful, with no major wars enveloping Europe again, until the War of the Austrian Succession broke out in 1740. There were other issues that arose during the reign between George and some political groupings in England. One concerned religion and his attitude towards the Church of England. George was a Lutheran, a moderate Protestant. On the surface, this posed little problem, but England had a complicated religious landscape in which Protestants were not simply opposed to Catholics. There were both moderate and radical forms of Protestantism, with Anglicans who conformed to the Church of England being the more moderate wing, while others were favourers of Calvinism, or Puritanism, as it is termed in England. Both sides feared that George would prove either too moderate or too radical. In the end, he outflanked both sides by steering a via media, favouring a politique approach to religion, the primary goal of which was avoiding religious controversy of all kinds. Catholicism was the enemy in George's eyes, and so he sought to dampen religious tensions amongst Protestants. Elsewhere, when it came to Parliament, George was forced to make concessions in the form of the Peerage Bill of 1719, a piece of legislation which was introduced to halt the creation of new peers, or nobles, out of a general concern that too many Germans were being awarded British noble titles following the Hanoverian succession. The Peerage Bill was as much directed against the Prince of Wales as it was against the King himself. George's son, the future King George II, was a forceful figure who tried to play a role in British political life in the first years of his father's reign in Britain. This soon led to conflict between father and son in a relationship that had always been strained. Matters came to a head in 1717 over the arrangements for the baptizing of the Prince of Wales's son, George's grandson, Prince George William. The ceremony descended into an argument between the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Newcastle, leading to a challenge of a duel. Annoyed by this public display of impetuosity by his son, a rift ensued between king and prince, one that dragged on well into 1718. They were eventually reconciled to some extent, but the relationship between George and his heir was always a strained one. It is difficult to get a sense of who the man managing this transition in British government was. Historians have tended to view George as one of the most elusive and secretive of all the country's monarchs. There were contradictions. For instance, his correspondence with his daughter Sophia Dorothea indicates a loving parent. On the other hand, his treatment of his wife, Sophia's mother, was abysmal. The same contradictions existed when it came to his role as monarch. His failure to learn to speak English in advance of Anne's death, along with the sporadic manner in which he picked up some of the language thereafter, seems to indicate a lack of interest in what his British subjects thought of him. At the same time, however, there is evidence that when he did begin to learn more English in the 1720s, it was for the purposes of discerning how he was being written about in the English newspapers. He was socially awkward and never became comfortable. In his position as head of a large royal court, yet in more relaxed environments behind closed doors with friends, he could be strikingly informal for a monarch, favouring bawdy jokes and being quite self-deprecating. One thing is for sure, he was not, as some earlier generations of historians made out, an unintelligent man. No ruler that was dim could have managed the Hanoverian succession as successfully as he did, although he was not naturally inclined to be a sociable figure. George attempted to make himself a more publicly visible ruler in England than he had been in Hanover, the better to foster a closer relationship with his new subjects and offset the chances of any further revolts, such as those which had already marked the first year of his reign. A notable element of this was his public feasts that he held at one of the more prominent royal residences of the 18th century, Hampton Court. During the summers, he would invite dozens of guests to these feasts, held on the grounds of this location, while more still would be invited to attend the gardens there, where George would progress in the evenings, meeting his subjects and hearing their petitions. Through these interactions and his own efforts, he slowly began to learn English. How fluent he became has been debated, but there are government documents from the 1720s, years after he arrived in England, which demonstrate that he was able to read English to a certain extent by that time. He also presided over regular hunting, trips to which members of England's nobility and political and economic communities were invited. Spending on his court was high and was geared towards winning over the political classes in England, cementing the status of the Hanoverian Dynasty as the new royal family. It must be said that George's court did not offer patronage to many great thinkers. This, though, was something of an accidental happenstance of the times. It simply so happened that numerous prominent academics and artistic figures within British society had either died or were at the twilight of their lives. When George came to the throne, John Locke, the great philosopher and essayist, had died in 1704. Christopher Wren, the brilliant architect who oversaw the reconstruction of London following the Great Fire of 1666, was still alive, though his foremost accomplishments were behind him when George came to England, and Wren died in 1723. Isaac, Newton, the father of modern physics and one of the most accomplished scientists in human history, was kept on as Master of the Royal Mint by George, though he was already in his 70s at the time of the Hanoverian succession, and his most pioneering work lay behind him. Others, such as the poet Alexander Pope, who were in the full prime of their career, were satirists of the royal court. While there was no Wren, Locke, or Newton in their full brilliance for George to patronise, he did support the London theatres in the cultural sphere, with the Haymarket Theatre opening its doors in the capital in 1720. The king frequented the London theatres when productions of French plays by the likes of Molière, Corneille, and Racine were being staged, his limited grasp of English reducing the degree to which he favoured English playwrights. If there was one brilliant cultural figure associated with George's court in England, it was surely the composer George Frederick Handel. Born in Halle in Germany in 1685, Handel had learned his craft in Germany and Italy before relocating to London in 1712. On an invitation from Charles Montague, the first Duke of Manchester, he was still there when George succeeded to the throne. In 1714, a fortuitous succession, as Handel had briefly served as Kapellmeister, or Master of the Choir in Hanover, in 1710, in George's employ, as Elector of Hanover. Over the next 30 years, he would compose an enormous array of operas and librettos in England, emerging as arguably the greatest England-based composer of the Baroque and classical eras of Western music, and the only figure associated with the Hanoverian court that could compare with composers like Johann Sebastian Bach and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart on the continent in the 18th century. George patronised some of Handel's work, and many of his operas premiered at the King's Theatre in London during the 1720s. Surely one of George's most significant, though underrated accomplishments, was the manner in which he furthered the expansion of Britain's burgeoning empire. When he came to the throne, England had already settled colonies in many regions. By then, the initial English colonies that had been founded in Virginia and New England in the early 17th century had been expanded through the granting of new charters to would-be colonists and war with the Dutch to secure New Netherland, which was seized and renamed New York, resulting in an unbroken string of colonies stretching from New Hampshire in the north-south to the Carolinas. In the Caribbean, there were numerous prosperous sugar plantation colonies on islands like Jamaica, Barbados, and smaller enclaves like St. Kitts and Nevis. Elsewhere, while England only had a few coastal toeholds in India, its commercial activities here were expanding under the aegis of the English East India Company. This was a significant base to commence from. George's reign saw a modest but important expansion of this colonial activity. One notable element of this, which still impacts the geography and administration of the United States 3 centuries later, was the establishment of a new colony in the region lying south of the Carolinas and north of the Spanish presence in Florida. Colonists had begun settling here to avoid the jurisdiction of either the Carolina or Virginia colonial governments in the late 17th century. But the expansion into the area accelerated in the 1710s and 1720s. George's government encouraged and began preparing to establish a new proprietorial colony there, though it would be a few years after his death that this was finalized. It was named Georgia and would go on to become the modern-day US state that bears the same name. Elsewhere, a British colony on the island of Newfoundland in what is now eastern Canada that had been established during the latter stages of Queen Anne's reign was expanded by George's government. While in the Caribbean, the Bahamas became a British crown colony in the 1720s after George's government had engaged in an extensive campaign to suppress the pirates operating here in the second half of the 1710s. In other respects, George's reign set more nefarious precedents. The 1710s and 1720s saw a considerable increase in Britain's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, and the king himself benefited hugely from this trade. George's profits from the slave trade accrued primarily from his position as governor of the South Sea Company, a joint stock company which had been established in 1711 with the goal of reducing the national debt after years of involvement in the War of the Spanish Succession. This was to be achieved by undertaking new trading voyages to the South Seas, the early modern term for the South Pacific, an area which, unlike the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean, was still relatively underexplored and underexploited by the European powers in the 18th century. With the war coming to an end as George III took the throne, and with a new monopoly on slave trading between Africa and certain South American ports within Spain's empire as a concession of the peace talks, speculative investment poured into the South Sea Company. There had been economic bubbles already in the history of nascent European capitalism, notably the tulip mania in the Dutch Republic back in the 1630s. But this was the first instance of this on such a scale in England, although it was a newly formed company and had realised no profits of any kind. When shares in the South Sea Company were floated in London in the late 1710s, a frenzy to acquire them began. The resulting bubble was exacerbated by the board members who exaggerated the scale of the perceived profits to be made. As a consequence, between late 1719 and May 1720, the price of shares rocketed up from just over $100 to $600, eventually reaching nearly £1,000 per share for a few days that summer. Then it all burst, and in the course of 1721, shares fell back to below $100. The South Sea Company did not go bust and would function as a valuable joint stock company until the mid-19th century, exploiting things like the whaling industry in the South Atlantic. However, the South Sea Bubble of 1720 ruined the personal finances of many individuals. Incredibly, even before the bubble burst, George's government had already passed the Bubble Act in June 1720, which sought to prevent further economic bubbles of the kind that was still underway. Bizarrely, even as the government was legislating against it, speculators continued to invest in the bubble. Beyond these colonial ventures, George's reign saw a reaffirmation of what is often termed the blue water policy in Britain's imperial history. This was an unwritten rule of English foreign and military policy to promote the Royal Navy as the best means of extending Britain's empire abroad and protecting Britain against all enemies at home in Europe. A policy of this kind could be said to have been initiated as far back as the reign of Elizabeth I in the second half of the 16th century, but successive reigns saw it reaffirmed, notably through the professionalization of the Royal Navy in the 17th century. The Hanoverians, beginning with George III, gave fresh impetus to this, and over the course of the next century and a half, Britain would emerge as the preeminent global superpower, based almost entirely on the strength of its navy and dominance of the world's seas. That process was already very much underway during George's reign. The manner in which British naval power was employed in the 1720s to curb efforts by Spain to retake Gibraltar and Minorca, which it had lost during the War of the Spanish Succession, underscored the manner in which effective British sea power would be the cornerstone of a successful foreign policy going forward in the 18th century. One part of Britain's empire, the one that was closest to home, was a perpetual problem, and in George's reign, this was no different. This was Ireland. The country had been partially conquered in the 12th and 13th centuries, then fully conquered in the 16th, but there had been major revolts there in the 1590s, the 1640s, and the late 1680s, all with the goal of re-establishing the paramount position of the Roman Catholic majority. All of these rebellions had been defeated and had led to a growing Protestant ascendancy, in which English, Welsh, and Scottish nobles and landlords controlled over 80% of the land, despite only constituting about 15% of the population. Even this Protestant elite were problematic in the eyes of administrators in London, and in the 1710s, a scandal had arisen whereby the Irish House of Lords had intervened in the management of the Irish courts. This was viewed as a step too far towards legislative and judicial independence in England, and in 1719, George's government oversaw the passage of the Declaratory Act. Given the royal assent by the king in 1720, it effectively subordinated the Irish Parliament to the English Parliament, and was an important step in the eventual disestablishment of the Irish Parliament in 1800 through the Act of Union, whereby the Irish Parliament was dispensed with altogether, and henceforth, Irish politicians had to take their seats in the English Parliament at Westminster. Measures like these, which were given George's imprimatur, did not go unopposed in Ireland. One of the most vocal critics of the policies of the early Hanoverian government was Jonathan Swift. Swift was an Anglo-Irish satirist and writer who also served as the Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. His reputation was already established by the time George ascended to the throne in England in 1714, but it was during George's reign that he wrote many of his most famous works, most of which were veiled critiques of crown policy in Ireland. Gulliver's Travels, published in 1726, is the most well-known, but the text, which most directly attacked the king and his government, was the Drapier's Letters. These were a series of 7 pamphlets, published in 1724 and 1725, in response to the granting of a license to produce copper coins in Ireland to William Wood, an ironmonger and manufacturer. The license was highly unorthodox and was only granted to Wood in 1722 because he had paid a huge $10,000 bribe to George's long-term mistress and the mother of his younger children, Melusine von der Schulenburg. In attacking Wood and the manner in which he had received his license to mint coins by bribing the royal mistress, Swift was taking a major risk, and the texts were published pseudonymously under the name M.B. Drapier, though it was widely known that Swift was the author. Swift only became more audacious in his satire, and towards the end of George's reign, he began working on what would eventually be published in 1729 as a modest proposal for preventing the children of poor people from being a burthen to their parents or country, a scathing attack on English attitudes towards poor Irish Catholics, in which he satirically proposed that children should be sold as food to the rich in order to disburden the Hanoverian state of the cost of providing them with charity. To add to the many overseas realms that George had to manage, he still had the government of Hanover to oversee. Unlike Britain, Ireland, and the British colonies in North America and the Caribbean, the German lands remained directly under George's control and were not subject to oversight by the British Parliament or George's ministers in England. Although he lived for most of his life after 1714 in England, George returned to Germany periodically, visiting in 1716, 1719, 1723, and again in 1725, the latter visit carrying on into early 1726. In total, he spent approximately 2.5 years in Hanover between 1714 and 1727. During one of these visits, he finalized the Treaty of Charlottenburg, through which an alliance was formalized between Britain, Prussia, and the electorate of Hanover, though many of the terms outlined in it, including marriage alliances that would involve George's children and grandchildren, were never followed through on. The episode is indicative of the international diplomacy which generally ensued when George visited Hanover, though the day-to-day governance of his German dominions was placed in the hands of administrators such as Andreas Gottlieb von Bemstorff and Hans Caspar von Bothmer, whom George trusted implicitly to run affairs in his absence. More generally, George was at his happiest in these years when visiting home, and the role of being King of Britain and Ireland was evidently a burden on him rather than a sought-after desire. George's final years were ones of increasing retirement. He allowed Walpole to continue running the government and stepped back even further from day-to-day administration. The few acts which he did engage in were symptomatic of this. For instance, George is generally credited with creating the Order of the Bath, one of Britain's highest chivalric honour classes, in 1725, junior today only to the Order of the Garter and the Order of the Thistle. But the new honour was really Walpole's design as he developed a new honour which he could use to reward his own allies, and it became a form of patronage offered by him as Prime Minister rather than by the King as monarch. Elsewhere, the Treaty of Charlottenburg was followed by the Treaty of Hanover in 1725, through which Britain, Hanover, Prussia, and France allied with one another in response to the signing of the Treaty of Vienna months earlier, which had seen Austria and Spain draw closer to one another. The effects of this were considerable. For decades, Britain had been closely aligned with Austria, but George's reign saw this alliance end and a reorientation to draw closer to Prussia, the emerging German power. Beyond such concerns, George spent much of his later years engaging with his growing brood of grandchildren. An interesting side note is that in the second half of 1726, he offered a home in exile to a young Voltaire, the future giant of the French Enlightenment, having had to absent himself from France after getting into an argument with the powerful Duc de Rohan. It was in England that Voltaire came into contact with an environment of liberality that he later claimed shaped his work for decades to come after he returned to France. George was in his mid-60s by the summer of 1727, when he determined to visit Hanover again. Having been in England for nearly a year and a half, he had made it across the Channel and was travelling through the Dutch Republic when he became ill in mid-June. As the royal entourage stopped that evening, he complained of stomach cramps and chest pains, something which he initially attributed to indigestion from having consumed too much fruit the previous evening, insisting that they continue on their way. With medical staff attending to him in his carriage, George suffered a stroke early in the morning of the 9th of June. The party rushed to the city of Osnabrück, where George died 2 days later on the 11th of June at 67 years of age. His remains were taken on to Hanover, and he was interred in the Schloss Palace in his homeland, though he was subsequently reburied at the Herrenhausen Gardens after the Second World War. George was the last reigning British monarch to be buried outside of England, and just one of 6 since the Norman conquest to be so, the others being William the Conqueror, Henry II, and Richard I in the 11th and 12th centuries, James II in France as a result of his being deposed in 1688, and Philip II, who was buried in Spain, the realm he governed for decades in the 16th century after his wife Mary Tudor died in 1558. As such, George's burial in Germany was a very unusual development for an English monarch. George's reign in many ways laid the foundation for the massive expansion of the British Empire over the next century. During the reign of his son and successor, King George II, which lasted down to 1760, Britain's commercial and colonial interest grew, with the first array of large conquests in India in the mid-1750s, around the same time that Britain was displacing the French from Canada. Not long afterwards, James Cook would begin his expeditions to the South Seas, around which there had been so much speculative investment in George's time, exploring much of the Pacific Ocean and paving the way for British colonization of Australia, New Zealand, and Tasmania. By the time George's great-grandson, King George III, died in 1820, the sun rarely set on the British Empire, and Britain had emerged as the wealthiest nation in the world, the home of the Industrial Revolution and modern capitalism. That this was possible was owing to the political stability at home in England, which ensued from the Hanoverian succession. George I is a generally underappreciated British monarch. There are plenty of reasons why this is the case. Britain, for instance, did not fight in any major war during his reign, other than playing a small role in the Northern War, and he was a generally uncontroversial monarch. His reign was rather dull, in a sense, by comparison with the civil wars and political battles which characterized England's history in the 17th century, or indeed the much more colourful reign of his great-grandson, George III, in whose time the American Revolutionary War was fought, the British Raj was formed, Britain led resistance to the French Empire of Napoleon Bonaparte, and the Industrial Revolution began. But in a way, what Britain needed in 1714 when George came to the throne was a dull monarch, one who would oversee the Hanoverian succession without arousing too much animosity, and who allowed the British political, economic, and colonial system to continue evolving in the way it had been for decades, resulting in a growing commercial system and a constitutional monarchy that was beginning to resemble a modern parliamentary democracy. George might not have been a great monarch, but he was an ideal monarch to establish the Hanoverian Dynasty and put Britain on the path to becoming the world's preeminent superpower in the 19th century. George, later crowned King George II of Britain and Ireland, entered the world on November 10, 1683, at Herrenhausen Palace in Hanover, a lively city in northern Germany. Born into one of the bigger players among Germany's patchwork of states, his dad, Georg Ludwig, ruled Hanover and later became King George I. His mum, Sophia Dorothea of Chell, faced a stormy marriage that shaped young George's life in ways we'll dig into below. His father was Georg Ludwig, the ruler of Hanover. He would become the Prince Elector of Hanover in 1692, when his official title was elevated within the Holy Roman Empire, the loose political organization which covered Germany at the time. He would also become King George the Fudge of Britain and Ireland, many years later in 1714. George's mother was Sophia Dorothea of Chell, daughter of the Duke of Brunswick-Luneburg, George William. She had married slightly less than 12 months before her son's birth, and he was their first child. They would have only one other child, a daughter named Sophia Dorothea, after her mother, born 4 years after George. George's early life was overshadowed by the difficulties in his parents' marriage. This was never a good one, and it took a more sinister turn when George was a child of 10 and 11. George Ludwig and Sophia Dorothea had been largely living apart for some time by then. The discovery that she was engaged in an affair with a Swedish count by the name of Philip Christoph von Königsmark prompted a response which saw Sophia effectively placed under a form of house arrest in Celle in 1694 that lasted for over 30 years down to her death in 1726. George would never see his mother again after she was sent away, and his attachment to her memory was at least partly the cause of some of the difficulties in the relationship between him and his father in future years. After his mother's banishment, George was principally raised in the household of his paternal grandparents. He was tutored by numerous individuals, amongst whom Johann Hilmar Holstein was prominent as his languages tutor. George grew up to be able to speak German, French, English, and Italian, as well as having some Latin. His primary interest lay in history and military studies, and George was not shy of going into battle himself, as we will see. On the 2nd of September 1705, George married Caroline, a daughter of Johann Friedrich, the Margrave of Brandenburg-Ansbach in eastern Germany. This came after unsuccessful attempts to negotiate a marriage alliance with the Swedes through a union of George with Hedvig Sophia, a daughter of King Charles V of Sweden. George and Caroline were virtually the same age, she being only 8 months older than George. Children soon followed. The eldest, who would be George's heir for much of the next half a century, was a boy named Frederick, born in January 1707. He was the first of 8 children, 5 girls, named Anne, Amelia, Caroline, Mary, and Louisa, would follow between 1709 and 1724. The couple had 2 further sons, George William, born in 1717, and William August, born in 1721. Most lived long lives, though George William died in infancy, and Caroline suffered at least 2 miscarriages and a stillbirth. The marriage was a strange one by modern standards, albeit not entirely unusual for the time. George and Caroline were reasonably close, but this did not stop him from keeping a string of mistresses throughout virtually the entirety of their 30-plus-year marriage. On the other hand, George consistently demonstrated his trust in his wife in the late 1720s and early 1730s, when he appointed her as his representative when he left England on official duties. George was naturalized as an English citizen and made a member of one of the most important knightly orders there, the Order of the Garter, in the summer of 1706, as well as being given the title of Duke of Cambridge in the peerage there a few months later. This was all part of the expected succession of the Hanoverians to the British throne in years to come. He was also involved in the War of the Spanish Succession with the British. The conflict had broken out in 1701 over a dispute as to who should succeed to the Spanish throne after the direct line of the Spanish Habsburgs died out, with both France and Austria putting forth a candidate. The disagreement soon spawned a Europe-wide war. The Prince-Electorate of Hanover sided with Austria, as the Austrian Habsburgs were virtually the hereditary heads of the Holy Roman Empire by then. Yet the Hanoverians tried to limit their involvement as much as possible in practice. The same was not true of George. An enthusiastic military campaigner, he fought on the British and Austrian side at the very important Battle of Oudenarde in the Spanish Netherlands west of Brussels on the 11th of July 1708 against the French. Here he showed considerable bravery, having a horse shot out from underneath him during the fighting, where others of his status might simply have watched from the rear. Soon George's fate would lie more in England than in Germany. For many years it had been clear that a succession issue was brewing in England. It was this which had resulted in George being made Duke of Cambridge in 1706. Queen Anne was the last direct member of the House of Stuart who could plausibly sit on the throne in Britain, her half-brother being a Roman Catholic in exile and disbarred from succeeding owing to his religion. Consequently, George's father was the likeliest successor, by right of George's grandmother being the granddaughter of King James VI, who had ruled England between 1603 and 1625, with Anne having suffered an appalling series of stillbirths and failed pregnancies, and the 5 live-born children she gave birth to having generally died before the age of 2. She had no children of her own left to succeed her after 1700. Therefore, when she died on the 1st of August 1714, it was evident that George's father would succeed as King George I of Britain and Ireland. One day, George would succeed him as George II if he lived that long. With that in mind, the Hanoverians prepared to head for England. It was a peculiar scenario. The new king only had a very bare grasp of English. The first years of George's time in England were difficult ones in some respects. His relationship with his father had been fraught for some time, something which would become a tradition between king and heir within the House of Hanover. It only worsened in the years from 1714 onwards in his position as Prince of Wales, the formal title he held as heir to the British throne. A major quarrel broke out between father and son in 1717. This had been brewing for some time and was in part owing to the relative popularity of George in contrast to his father, who was deemed aloof by his new subjects, preferring a slimmed-down court and his own company to a more colourful court. The incident which sparked a full rift was the christening of George's ill-fated son, George William, who would die after just 3 months. The king insisted on the Duke of Newcastle being appointed as the child's godfather, something to which George objected. An argument ensued during the ceremony, in the course of which Newcastle mistakenly thought George was challenging him to a duel. In the furore which followed, the king kicked George and his family out of St. James's Palace and informed many at court that they would have to choose between their loyalties to him or the Prince of Wales. It was an overreaction on George's, father's part. Still, it took 2.5 years before a reconciliation of a kind was reached in April 1720, and even then, the relationship between the prince and the king remained strained for the remainder of George III's life. George III died on the 11th of June 1727 while travelling from the Low Countries to northern Germany during one of his frequent visits to Hanover. A sign that he had never fully acclimatized to being ruler of Britain was seen in the fact that he was buried in Hanover 3.5 weeks later, not in England. A strange development, which quickly followed, concerned the late king's will. It was presented at a council meeting shortly after news of his death arrived in London. There, George II duly pocketed it, and it was never seen again. Other copies had been left on the continent, but could not be easily located at the time. Historians have since determined that it probably contained a clause whereby, once Prince Frederick, George's eldest son and the new Prince of Wales, died, the Hanoverian territories would be divided, with one heir staying as King of Britain and Ireland, and the Prince Electorate of Hanover passing to another branch of the family. George clearly did not want his father pulling such strings from beyond the grave. Whether he destroyed the will or it was lost in some other fashion remains unclear. The new king and his queen were crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 11th of October 1727, in a rather modestly budgeted and quickly organised affair. It was notably carried out to the sound of music composed by George Frederick Handel. These included Zadok the Priest, a stirring arrangement which has been performed prior to the anointing of every British monarch since 1727. George had ascended the throne at a critical juncture in British political and colonial history. As recently as the 16th century, England had been considered one of Europe's second-tier powers, dwarfed by the Habsburgs of Spain and Austria, and standing firmly in the shadow of the Dutch Republic in terms of its trading and commercial power. That had changed by the early 18th century, as the English began colonizing much of the eastern seaboard of North America from 1607 onwards, occupying many small islands in the West Indies, which became valuable sugar colonies, and establishing a significant presence in Asia under the rubric of the English East India Company. It had also eclipsed the Dutch as the preeminent naval and trading power of Northern Europe through 3 wars with them in quick succession between 1652 and 1674. By the dawn of the 18th century, it was entering into a period of prolonged rivalry with France to become the foremost power in Europe, one that saw the two states at war with each other so frequently between 1689 and 1815 that many historians now speak of a second 100 years war between England and France during this era, the first having occurred back between 1337 and 1453. George's reign was critical in that tussle. While France had very much been the more powerful state when this commenced in the late 17th century, his 33-year reign would see the pendulum swing in Britain's favour. This was an age of extensive letter writing and diary keeping, much more so than previous centuries, and we have a good idea of how George conducted his daily routines as king, both from his own pen and those who spent time around him. From these, we learn that he was a monarch who took an active interest in political affairs. At the same time, he could hardly be described as a workaholic or someone who was concerned with the minutiae of administration. He spent much of his time hunting and engaged in what were considered traditional royal and aristocratic pursuits. The hours of the day that he did meet senior figures within the government, notably Robert Walpole, considered the first Prime Minister of Britain and, the longest serving, saw him take a keen interest in foreign affairs. This was hardly out of the ordinary. Britain was at war for over half of the 33 years that George was on the throne. The new king didn't display the same regard for domestic affairs, and he tended to leave these to Walpole and others. As we will see, he has often been smeared as being a figure who was dominated by the senior politicians of the age. Clearly, there were reasons for such an approach. The court formalities of the 18th century, with their endless morning and evening rituals, banquets and court engagements, left little time for sitting at a desk worrying over the specifics of economic or judicial policy. Luckily, we also have some colourful accounts of George's life as king and his personality. Surely the most salacious are those of John Hervey, a secretary to the Prime Minister Robert Walpole. His memoirs were considered too revelatory of royal life to be published in the 18th century. In them, he revealed how the king kept a string of mistresses, most notably the Countess of Suffolk, Henrietta Howard, and the Countess of Deloraine, Mary Scott, but that there was a bizarre level of formality when he engaged with them, almost as though he was welcoming foreign dignitaries to his court. George was not exactly kind when it came to ending these trysts. He intended to dismiss the Countess of Suffolk from court at one juncture on the basis of her being old and increasingly deaf, only for the Queen, George's wife, to have to intervene on her behalf. Deloraine was described as constantly smelling of Spanish wine. Elsewhere, we see a king with a foul mouth, one who surrounded himself with individuals with a childish sense of humour. It was considered comical to pull the seat out from under someone as they were about to sit down, sending them cascading to the floor. A less pleasant aspect to all of this, though, was George's temper, which was considerable. He was regularly seen throwing off his wig and kicking it about the royal apartments, while swearing intensely, or sulking and refusing to engage with people who had committed minor infractions. This was the man who became king in 1727. By the 18th century, the monarchs of Britain were no longer as powerful as most other European monarchs. Through a series of constitutional changes and wars stretching back to the Magna Carta of 1215 and forward to the Glorious Revolution of 1688, Britain had become a constitutional monarchy. Kings and queens still had considerable power in the 18th century, but Parliament was the preeminent authority in the country and managed political affairs on a day-to-day basis. Where George did have a role to play was in deciding on senior ministerial positions and trying to balance the often competing interests of the two major political parties, the conservative Tories and the more liberal Whigs. Robert Walpole, who is generally deemed to have been Britain's first Prime Minister, was already in office when George became king, and he did not change that arrangement, with Walpole remaining in post until 1742. Charles, Viscount Townshend, a brother-in-law of Walpole's, was a close ally as leader of the House of Lords, though he stepped down in 1730. As both men were long-standing leaders of the Whigs, George's reign, at least in the first half of it, has been viewed as being dominated by the more liberal-leaning party. This had a particular impact on religious affairs during George's reign, as one of the cornerstones of Whig liberalism was a tolerance for most strands of Protestantism, whereas the Tories at this time argued for a narrower adherence to the Anglicanism of the Church of England. The years of Walpole's ministry during George's reign were relatively peaceful ones until late on in it. A short war was fought with Spain between 1727 and 1729. This was largely ignited by the Spanish in the final months of George I's reign, as they initiated a siege of the Rock of Gibraltar, a possession in the southern tip of Spain, which had been lost to the British at the end of the War of the Spanish Succession a decade and a half earlier. After limited clashes and naval action in the Caribbean, the war petered out in 1729 without achieving much. Thereafter, Walpole engineered an ever closer relationship with Austria on the international front, something which George was inclined towards as one of the electors of the Holy Roman Empire. Despite the king and queen's tendency towards intervention, Walpole also kept Britain out of the short-lived War of the Polish Succession in the mid-1730s. At home, this decade saw numerous land tax acts in support of the crown pass through Parliament, something which impacted George's household and court. Beyond this, there was little marquee legislation passed during this era. Instead, a perusal of the statutes of the Parliament of Great Britain highlights the emergence of a modern parliament, one which was concerned with rather routine issues of government. Everything from the regulation of the sale of hats to the cutting of hedges on the sides of the king's highways was legislated for. A growing problem in these years was one that George had experienced before. However, previously he had been on the other side of it. This concerned his relationship with his own heir, his eldest son Frederick. Frederick had been left in Germany at the time of the Hanoverian succession and spent nearly 14 years being raised there while his father and mother were in England. When the Prince of Wales arrived in England to take up his position as heir in 1727, he was consequently something of a stranger to George. The relationship between king and heir was difficult following Frederick's arrival in London, and it did not improve the longer they spent in the same country. They boiled over nearly a decade into the reign after Frederick married Augusta of the House of Saxe-Gotha, and almost immediately appealed to Parliament without consulting his father to increase his allowance now that he was mired in the business of producing his own heir. George's famous temper exploded at this perceived act of betrayal, and, in an almost carbon copy of the dispute between him and his own father back in 1717, he threw Frederick and his new wife out of St. James's Palace. The rift would not be healed for many years, and there were constant rumours that the king intended to bypass Frederick in favour of his other surviving son, William, Duke of Cumberland, with whom he had a much better relationship. The difficulties of this father-son relationship for George were added to when Queen Caroline died in November 1737, when a hernia ruptured her bowel. Her and George's marriage had been a strange one. His constant infidelity didn't speak of a close attachment, yet he was genuinely distraught at her passing, and somewhat touchingly insisted he would not remarry when she was on her deathbed. Conflicts of another kind were brewing on the continent. In 1739, Britain ended up at war with Spain again. It became known as the War of Jenkins' Ear, as the British government launched it based on an incident back in 1731, when a British seaman, Robert Jenkins, had his ship boarded and his ear cut off by Spanish mariners. In reality, the incident was simply dredged up as a relatively good excuse for going to war with Spain in order to improve Britain's position in the Caribbean. The War of Jenkins' Ear soon morphed into a wider European conflict, one which would run through nearly a decade in the middle of George's reign. This was the War of the Austrian Succession. This war came about owing to the issue of female succession in the lands of the Austrian Habsburgs, which included most of modern-day Austria, Hungary, Czechia, Slovenia, and Croatia, as well as additional lands in Italy and the Austrian Netherlands. Back in 1713, Charles VI, Holy Roman Emperor and Archduke of Austria, had overseen the passage of a pragmatic sanction to ensure that his niece, Maria Josepha, could potentially succeed him if he died childless, as his marriage had not yet resulted in children. This was needed to overturn the Salic law, a very old medieval law which prevented women from succeeding to the throne in several European countries. Just a few years later, Charles's marriage did produce children, but this was a daughter by the name of Maria Theresa. Thus, the pragmatic sanction was still needed when Charles died in 1740 to allow Maria Theresa to succeed. War followed because a number of the European powers, foremost amongst which were Prussia, Bavaria, and Saxony, all saw the possibility of making gains in Germany by objecting to Maria Theresa's succession as Holy Roman Empress. So began the War of the Austrian Succession in December 1740. Britain did not have a clear interest in the war when what was primarily a Central European affair broke out. Instead, its entry into it was predicated on a number of other factors. First and foremost, France quickly entered the war on the side of Prussia, and it was clear that the French intended to use the conflict as an opportunity to seize some of the Austrian Netherlands in what is now Belgium. Given the constant rivalry between the French and British at the time, there was no doubt that the British would quickly ally with Austria to block French ambitions. Secondly, George II did have a personal interest in the German dimension of the conflict as Prince Elector of Hanover. Therefore, Britain was partially dragged into the War of the Austrian Succession on account of George's Hanoverian ties. The war would last for 8 years. Much of the fighting played out in Central Europe and the Low Countries. British contributions were primarily seen in the latter region and the Rhineland, as well as at sea, where the British Royal Navy faced both French and Spanish flotillas in a wide theatre of naval warfare in the Atlantic and the Caribbean. George, took what by the 18th century was a very unusual decision for a British monarch, to campaign militarily in person during the war. In the summer of 1743, at nearly 60 years of age, he headed for the continent to take personal command of the British army there, one which was seeking to make a breakthrough in association with the Austrians against the French in the Rhineland. Hence, followed the Battle of Dettingen near Mainz on the 27th of June 1743. Here, a joint British and Austrian force of over 30,000 faced a substantially numerically inferior French army of not much more than 20,000 men. The fighting only lasted for a few hours and ended when the French, recognizing that their strategic situation was not ideal, retreated across the River Main. The majority of the casualties that they suffered occurred because one of the bridges that they used to traverse the river collapsed. Dettingen had little strategic bearing on the wider course of the war, yet George earned a lot of respect back home for campaigning in person. It was the last time that a reigning British monarch would campaign militarily in this way. By the time the Battle of Dettingen was fought, the War of the Austrian Succession had descended into something of a stalemate. Facing the combined forces of Austria, Britain and France, the French could not make a major breakthrough in the Netherlands or the Rhineland, and the conflict in Central Europe had become a to and fro affair. Several more years of conflict followed before both sides reached the realization that their treasuries could not tolerate the financial cost of such pointless warfare. The British and French were already engaging in peace talks by 1746. However, it took until October 1748 before the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle was agreed to by all parties. The delay was owing to Austrian unwillingness to meet the Prussian demand that it cede the province of Silesia around the modern-day junction of Germany, Poland and Czechia to Prussia. This was a very valuable province, one with extensive coal and mineral mines, and the Austrians were reluctant to relinquish it. Eventually, the British convinced them that this was the only way to end the war and ensure European-wide recognition of Maria Theresa's position as Archduchess of Austria and Holy Roman Empress. The Austrians relented, but the implications were significant, effectively sundering the long-standing Anglo-Austrian alliance that had existed in one form or another since the late 1680s. When another European war broke out, the Austrians and British would be on different sides. The War of the Austrian Succession might have started as a Central European issue. Nevertheless, it had colonial implications, especially the clash within it between the British and Spanish. A huge part of this was connected to the growing dominance of the slave trade by the British. Curiously, the age of the Enlightenment in Europe, when the abolitionist movement emerged, was also the era when the transatlantic slave trade was at its very worst. Britain was central to it, and ports like Liverpool and Bristol benefited enormously from the trade in human beings between 1700 and 1800. There is no avoiding George's role in this. He was the governor of the South Sea Company between 1727 and 1760, a monopoly that controlled much of Britain's slave trade, as his father had been before him, and as George III would be, until the slave trade was abolished by the British Parliament in 1807. During the period he was governor, tens of thousands of slaves were trafficked across the Atlantic by the South Sea Company. George also expressed views which indicated his support for the slave trade, and he himself owned slaves on plantations in the West Indies that the Crown had a stake in. In the midst of the War of the Austrian Succession, the House of Hanover faced the gravest threat to it in Britain from the Jacobite cause that had yet been seen. The Jacobites were the supporters of the line of King James II, Jacobus being the Latin for James. That monarch had been deposed in England back in 1688 on the grounds of being a Roman Catholic. He and his descendants from his second marriage to Mary of Modena had subsequently lived in exile in France. His son had attempted an uprising in Scotland in 1715, shortly after the ascent of the House of Hanover, to little avail. Much more serious was the rising which Charles Edward Stuart, the grandson of King James II, attempted in 1745 in Scotland. He arrived there after ensuring the support of numerous senior Scottish aristocrats, including the Dukes of Perth and Athol. After commencing the revolt in August, they quickly seized control of Edinburgh and then proceeded southwards. The Jacobite forces reached as far as Derby in England. They soon retreated back to Scotland, for the Jacobite support, which Charles had assured his Scottish followers would materialise in northern England, never came. The rising was snuffed out when an English force under George's younger son, William, Duke of Cumberland, defeated the Scots at the Battle of Culloden on the 16th of April 1746. Charles Edward Stuart fled back to the continent. He would live for over 40 years after this, only dying in Rome in 1788. He never gave up on his hopes of leading a fresh expedition to Britain, though in reality, the Jacobite cause never threatened the House of Hanover again after the Jacobite Rising of 1745. The years following the end of the War of the Austrian Succession were dominated by a succession crisis in England. While George had partially reconciled with Frederick in the course of the mid-1740s, this was merely a public formality, and as late as 1748, he was heard to proclaim his disdain for his heir. Nevertheless, Frederick would not succeed him. On the 31st of March 1751, he died suddenly while playing cricket on the lawns of Leicester House in London after being hit by a ball. It used to be believed that the blow had resulted in a lung abscess. Recent studies have conversely conjectured that his death was the product of a pulmonary embolism, the blockage of an artery leading into the lungs. Frederick's untimely passing cast open the issue of the succession, with some speculating that this now made the likelihood of the Duke of Cumberland succeeding George as his younger son a possibility once again. The king, though, was happy to allow Frederick's eldest son from his marriage, Prince George, a 12-year-old at the time of his father's death in 1751, to become his heir in line with the natural order of succession. George, it should be remembered, ruled territories beyond Britain. He showed virtually zero interest in Ireland and never visited the country. Regardless, or perhaps because of this, he was esteemed there to a greater degree than many other British monarchs. This was because the country had done relatively well economically during his reign, as the port cities and towns benefited from extensive Atlantic trade as a stopping-off point in voyages between Britain and the 13 colonies in North America, while Dublin had emerged as one of Europe's great capitals. A sign of this was seen when a very large equestrian statue of George was raised on the Grand Parade in the city of Cork, following his death at the corporation's own expense. On the continent, George did not have anywhere near the affinity for Hanover that his father had before him. George I had spent large parts of his reign as King of Great Britain and Ireland in Germany, visiting Hanover whenever business in England allowed. George II was a much less frequent visitor to his homeland, though he did occasionally return there, the last such visit being in 1755. Hanover was always a factor in his management of Britain's foreign policy as well, much to the annoyance of many senior politicians at Whitehall in the 1730s, 1740s, and 1750s. The politics of the middle and later stages of George's reign were less consistent than the first decade and a half of it, when Walpole had provided stability. Henry Pelham served as Prime Minister for over a decade from 1743 to 1754. In spite of this, the administration was much more fragmented, with John Carteret, 2nd Baron Carteret, being the real power in Parliament early on, and others such, as Lord Bath holding considerable authority in the years thereafter. A perennially rising figure at this time was William Pitt the Elder, who successively acquired positions as Paymaster of the Forces and eventually became leader of the House of Commons towards the end of George's reign. He would have risen to a senior post in British politics earlier had it not been for George disliking him intensely, an animosity which first emerged in 1735 and 1736, when Pitt established himself as a critic of the government in Parliament, and especially of its failure to intervene in the War of the Polish Succession. That George could not fully block Pitt's promotion in the 1740s and 1750s is a sign of how effective the constitutional monarchy in Britain was by the mid-18th century in terms of compartmentalizing the respective powers of the Crown and Parliament. Pelham's death in 1754 occurred at an inopportune time, as Britain was about to once more descend into another long war. The first stirrings of this occurred in North America, where Britain ruled the 13 colonies stretching between New Hampshire and Georgia along the east coast of the modern-day United States. France controlled New France, a territory which included the eastern provinces of modern-day Canada, but also, nominally, a stretch of land running from the Great Lakes south along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to Louisiana. The French presence in much of the latter region was very limited, with little more than a few forts and trading stations in places like Ohio. The goal of these was clearly to hem the 13 colonies in and prevent future British expansion. In North America inland, from places like New England and Pennsylvania, conflict broke out in 1754 after repeated clashes along the frontier in Canada, the Great Lakes, and the Ohio River. Both sides would involve their Native American allies in a clash which was memorably captured in James Fenimore Cooper's novel, The Last of the Mohicans. It was ultimately a very poor decision by the French to go to war here. Their colonial community in Quebec and other parts of eastern Canada was about 60,000 strong at the time. The population of the 13 colonies was at least 1.5 million. These resources would soon come to bear, and by the late 1750s, the British and their Iroquois allies had gained the upper hand, with Quebec falling to the British in 1759 and Montreal in 1760. The French and Indian Wars in North America soon morphed into a much wider conflict in 1756. The 7 Years' War, as it would become known, came about owing to diplomatic ruptures on the continent, with Austria determined to go to war with Prussia in an effort to recover the province of Silesia that it had lost back in 1748 at the end of the War of the Austrian Succession. The difference in this new instance was that Britain was now allied with Prussia and Austria with France. As ever, the fact that George was the Prince Elector of Hanover, as well as King of Great Britain and Ireland, complicated British foreign policy, though, in this case, British entry into the war was made easier by the fact that a limited colonial war with France in North America was already underway. The 7 Years' War that now ensued has been termed the first global conflict, as the fighting touched virtually every continent. The main theatres were in Europe and North America, yet there was also fighting in the Caribbean, South America, Western Africa, and India. George's role in managing parts of the war effort in London was made difficult by both his own old age and flagging health, and also his continuing resistance to the rise of William Pitt, whose ascendancy was being promoted amongst the Whigs when no statesman of ability emerged to replace Pelham after 1754. A compromise was subsequently worked out whereby Pitt became the leader of the House of Commons and the Duke of Newcastle. Thomas Pelham, brother of Henry and a protégé of Walpole's years earlier, was made Prime Minister in 1757. Newcastle had already filled the role between 1754 and 1756, though in something of a more interim capacity than he now achieved. He was the last Prime Minister of George's reign and served until 1762. Though things were going well in North America and at sea, the war effort proceeded poorly on the continent at first. On the 26th of July 1757, George's sole surviving son, the Duke of Cumberland, was defeated by a French force invading Hanover at the Battle of Hastenbeck. It ruined his previously successful military career and led to the Convention of Klosterzeven, whereby Hanover agreed to exit the war separately from Britain in order to avoid being occupied by the French. Under pressure from King Frederick II of Prussia and from Pitt in Parliament, George disavowed the agreement in 1758. War was not the only consideration of the 1750s for the king. Two events in the twilight of George's life were completely out of character. George II cannot be said to have been a cultured or cultivated man. He had a juvenile sense of humour and seemed to primarily be interested in cards and hunting. He almost never read and displayed a kind of fascination with the fact that his wife wished to have scholars and artists at the court, as though he couldn't wrap his head around why she would bother. It is somewhat surprising then to learn that in the 1750s, he presided over the creation of two very significant cultural institutions. For decades, there had been plans in England to create an institution which would house archives of documents, of historical significance and objects, one that might be called a museum, after the word mouseion, the Greek term for the Library of Alexandria in ancient times, named after the muses of Greek religion and mythology. When Sir Hans Sloane, a doctor and scientist from Ulster in the north of Ireland, died in 1753, he had assembled a huge collection to this end, one which he bequeathed to George with directives to use it to establish a museum. While he might have had little interest in it on a personal level, George should be credited for quickly ordering the passage of an Act of Parliament which created the British Museum. Over a quarter of a millennium later, it remains one of the greatest museums in the world. Part of the basis of the museum was the private papers which Sloane had collected over the decades. These, along with the enormous range of papers collected by the 17th century antiquarian Sir Robert Cotton, and the archives of the first Earl of Oxford, Robert Harley, were the foundational collections of the museum. Today, they are located separately and form the bedrock of the manuscript archives of the British Library. A fourth collection was soon added to the Sloane, Cottonian and Harleian manuscripts, and this again involved George II. In 1757, 4 years after the museum was established, he donated the old Royal Library to it, a set of some 2,000 rare manuscripts, and books collected by various monarchs of England and Britain since the late medieval era. Some of these are highly valuable ancient texts, illuminated manuscripts, and early printed books. A highlight is the Codex Alexandrinus, one of the 4 great uncial codices, the 4 earliest surviving manuscripts in ancient Greek dating to the 4th and 5th centuries AD. They still form the basis of the royal manuscripts at the British Library, a collection that George's successors would add to. In many ways, George's actions in establishing the British Museum in 1753 and the Royal Manuscripts Collection in 1757 were a product of his sheer disinterest in reading. Had he been more interested, he might have kept the royal collection to himself and added Sloane's archive to it, but instead, he gifted them to the nation, and in doing so, laid the basis for 2 of Britain's great cultural institutions, the British Museum and the British Library. Another development towards the end of George's reign would have an even greater long-term impact than the foundation of the British Museum. It happened on the other side of the world, in India. English involvement in the subcontinent had begun a century and a half earlier, when the English East India Company was founded in 1600 as one of the main joint stock companies being set up in London at the time to further English colonial activity and trade abroad. With the Anglo-Portuguese alliance of 1662, through which Catherine of Braganza married King Charles II, England received Bombay, modern-day Mumbai, as part of the marriage alliance. The English East India Company continued to expand their activities, thereafter acquiring footholds in Madras and Kolkata in the first half of the 18th century. There were impediments to further expansion though. Firstly, the French were colonial rivals here and had established their own bases around Pondicherry in the 1720s and 1730s. Secondly, the Indian states were much more technologically and organizationally advanced than, for instance, the native states that the Spanish had faced in Central and South America in the 16th century, and conquering them would be much more difficult. Still, they were also very divided, with the Mughal Empire controlling Delhi and much of the north, the Maratha Empire as the largest force in central India, numerous smaller states such as Hyderabad, and the Kingdom of Mysore dominating the southern half of the Deccan Plateau in the south of the subcontinent, and a large patchwork of kingdoms ruled by Nawabs in the east, of which Bengal was the most substantial. If the English East India Company handled things well, what it could do was play these competing powers off against each other and slowly increase its own power. Into this mix in the mid-1740s arrived Robert Clive, a young man from Shropshire, who had come to India to take up a position as a clerk with the East India Company. He gradually worked his way up to a military station and then a senior command position. Ironically, it was the wars back in Europe that accelerated English expansion in India over the next several years, as French efforts to undermine the East India Company's position forced the company to employ ever greater resources. There were clashes here between the British and French and their respective native allies in the 1740s and early 1750s, but it was really with the full outbreak of the 7 Years' War in 1756 that the fighting intensified. This culminated in the Battle of Plassey on the 23rd of June 1757, about 150 kilometers north of Kolkata. The battle was far from conclusive in terms of losses. However, it established the strategic and technological superiority of the English over the Indians, as Clive, with approximately 750 men and 2,000 native allies, managed to force a Bengali army of some 50,000 men to retreat after an intense cannon barrage. In the aftermath, Clive consolidated the company's hold over the Bengal region, vastly expanding English influence in India in the process. When news of the victory at Plassey arrived in England, which would have taken a considerable amount of time in an age when sea travel around southern Africa was still the swiftest means of delivering such news, it would have been greeted with great enthusiasm amongst the shareholders of the English East India Company in London. We don't know much of what George II thought about it, something which might have been revealed had more of the king's private papers survived. Most of them were destroyed after his lifetime, owing to poor rules concerning the preservation of state papers at the time. What we do know is that Plassey was just the beginning of a period of rapid English expansion in India. In the years that followed, the company moved further inland to consolidate its control of the region between Kolkata and Allahabad, while effectively removing the French from the scene and replacing them as the preeminent power along the Coromandel coast in the southeast of the subcontinent. Wars followed intermittently with the Marathas, the foremost power opposing company expansion. These would culminate in the capture of Delhi in 1803, although by then, much of the rest of India was already under English control. The British Raj would only come into existence in 1858, after company rule had resulted in a vast mutiny across India the previous year, and the government had to take more direct control over the administration of the region. However, the roots of British rule here were sown in the final years of the reign of George II. The final years of George's reign were inevitably taken up with the war with France. After an initial series of reverses and stalemates, things improved. From 1758 onwards, successful naval raids were launched on the French coast. These were not strategically significant in and of themselves, but they forced the French to allocate resources to defending various parts of northern and western France that could have been used to greater effect elsewhere. Further raids in Western Africa captured a number of French forts around modern-day Senegal. The most important development, by some distance, was the capture in April 1759 of the island of Guadeloupe in the Caribbean. This French sugar colony might have been small in geographical terms. However, it was so economically valuable that, when the French were forced to decide between ceding it or Canada during the peace talks at the end of the war, they chose to keep Guadeloupe and relinquished Canada to the British. Were it not for this small island and the capture of it in 1759, the history of North America might have been very different. At home, there was the perennial managing of political squabbles between William Pitt and Newcastle. The king also showed a concern for the political education of his grandson, the future King George III. There were the inevitable discussions about his marriage. The prince was enamored with Sarah Lennox, a sister of the Duke of Richmond, but he was quietly dissuaded from a relationship with her on the basis that he needed to marry someone from one of Europe's great royal or aristocratic houses for diplomatic reasons. Eventually, he would marry Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a union which would become one of the happier ones in British royal history, though this did not occur until after George II himself had passed. By the late 1750s, George was in increasingly poor health. He was, after all, in his mid-70s, and this was quite an old age in the 18th century. It was taking its toll. The king was largely deaf and had lost the sight in one of his eyes. On the other hand, he was not suffering from any clear illness that indicated he would soon die. Instead, the end, when it came, was sudden. On the morning of the 25th of October, 1760, he arose to drink his morning hot chocolate in his chambers at Kensington Palace, and then retired to his close stool. On the way back to his writing desk, a loud crash was heard, and when his valets reached the source of the noise, he was found collapsed on the floor. They managed to help him into his bed, where he died not long after, from what is understood to have been an aortic dissection, where blood begins to breach the walls of the aorta. He was 76 years of age, though owing to the divergences between the new-style Gregorian calendar in Hanover, where George was born in 1683, and the continuing adherence to the old-style Julian calendar in Britain until 1752, George was viewed as having recently turned 77 by some in England at the time. His funeral was held at Westminster Abbey on the 11th of November, and he was buried under the central aisle of Lady Chapel. In spite of his unfaithfulness to her, he left instructions for his marble coffin to be placed directly next to Queen Caroline's, with the sides of each removed so that their ashes could intermingle in death. He was the last monarch to be interred at Westminster Abbey, with monarchs from George III onwards buried at Windsor Castle. The tempo for the next quarter of a century of British growth had been set in George's reign. The English East India Company continued to expand at remarkable speed in one of the most peculiar stories of corporate success in human history. By the late 18th century, the English East India Company had conquered large stretches of the Indian subcontinent, paving the way for the creation of the British Raj in the 19th century. The 7 Years' War came to an end in 1763. Under the terms of the Treaty of Paris, the French ceded what is now eastern Canada to Britain, with huge implications for the political, cultural, and linguistic history of North America. Elsewhere, however, some problems had been bequeathed to his grandson, George III, who would reign as king for 60 years, albeit for much of which he was incapacitated owing to serious illness. In particular, the crown had failed to prepare, in any fashion, for how it might reward the colonial community of the 13 colonies for their service in fighting the French and their native allies from 1754 onwards. Within 15 years of George's death, they would be at war with the Crown government, and a year later they issued a Declaration of Independence through which they proclaimed the birth of a United States of America. The 13 colonies were lost under George III's watch, but things like this don't happen in a historical vacuum. Much of the roots of what went wrong in the colonies lie in the earlier reign of his grandfather. For a very long time, George II was viewed poorly by historians and the British public at large. Much of this was based on the belated publication of the memoirs of Walpole's secretary, John Hervey, in 1848. These painted the monarch in a less than flattering light, the very reason why they did not appear in print for nearly 90 years after George's passing. Here, a picture of a boorish and unimaginative monarch who was prone to violent tempers and whose swearing was frequent was presented, compounded by his lack of interest in high culture and his maintenance of many mistresses at court. However, in recent decades, his reputation has been somewhat rehabilitated. Emphasis has been placed on his balancing of political factions during his extended reign, and the manner in which the conflicts of the period left Britain in a much better position within the Second Hundred Years' War, being fought with France. Although it would be a few years after George's death that the Treaty of Paris of 1763 confirmed this. His reign was also a formative one in the history of the British Raj, with the 1750s setting off a chain of events which have left an indelible mark on a subcontinent that is home to 1 out of every 6 human beings today. George was a flawed monarch and an even more flawed person, but he was not one of England or Britain's worst. George, later crowned King George III of Great Britain and Ireland, was born on June 4, 1738, at Norfolk House in St James's Square, right in the heart of Westminster, London. His dad, Frederick, was the eldest son of King George II, and his mom, Augusta of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg, came from a prominent German noble family. As a kid in a German dynasty that had recently taken over the British throne, George's early life set him up for a reign full of massive changes, as we'll explore below. His father was Frederick, the eldest son of King George II, who had ruled England since 1727. The House of Hanover, from which Frederick was descended, had come to rule Britain in 1714, having previously only ruled as dukes and prince-electors of Brunswick-Luneburg, also known as the Electorate of Hanover in northern Germany. George was then effectively a member of a German family, which had fairly recently come to rule Britain. At the time of his son's birth, Frederick was the sitting Prince of Wales and heir apparent to the kingdom. George's mother was Augusta of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg. She was also descended from a prominent German noble family and had married Frederick in a dynastic union in 1736. The marriage had immediately resulted in children. A girl, named Augusta after her mother, was born in 1737, and a year later, George, and appeared, immediately becoming second in line to the throne of Great Britain. Young George was the first member of the House of Hanover who would go on to become king, who was actually born in England. Both George I and George II, the first two Hanoverian monarchs, were born in Hanover itself, as was George's own father. Both his parents spoke German as their native tongue. The family was part of a German royal dynasty, which had inherited the British throne after Queen Anne, the last of the Stuart monarchs, died with no children in 1714. An Act of Settlement in 1701, seeking to ensure a Protestant succession, selected the Hanoverians, who could trace their family back to the daughter of King James I, the first monarch of both England and Scotland, who reigned between 1603 and 1625. As such, George would be the first member of the family to have a strong English background, having been both born in London and raised in England. George was brought up speaking both German and English. However, there are mixed reports about his schooling. Some were worried that he was intellectually limited, but as time went by, George also learned to speak French, became a keen musician, and developed interests in astronomy, clocks, painting, reading, and playing chess, perhaps he would not become a good fit for the type of philosopher-king which the great Greek thinker Plato had defined as the ideal ruler of a state. But George would nevertheless prove to be a relatively astute and cultivated king one day. Little did anyone know at the time of his birth, but young George's accession to the throne of Great Britain would occur far more quickly than expected. In March of 1751, George's father, Frederick, died at Leicester House in London at just 44 years of age. At the time, it was believed that the prince, who was a keen cricketer, had died from a burst lung abscess which had occurred as a result of a blow from a cricket ball. However, the cause of death is now believed to have been a pulmonary embolism, a blockage of one of the arteries in his lungs. Whatever the cause of death, the implications were now clear. Suddenly, his 12-year-old son had become the heir apparent to George II, who in 1751 was already 67, a ripe old age for a British monarch at that time. Nevertheless, the aging king continued to live long enough for young Prince George to pass through his teenage years and reach young manhood before he became king. It was not until October 1760, by which time he was blind in one eye and partially deaf, that old King George died. He was succeeded by his 22-year-old grandson, who became King George III, and he would rule as King of Great Britain for the next 60 years, during the course of which time Europe and the world would experience changes unlike anything that had preceded them in human history. George faced a number of initial challenges. The first was on the international scene. When he became king, Britain was mired in a major war against France, with its combatants fighting in Europe and as far afield as North America, the Caribbean, and India, where the two powers were rivals for colonial supremacy. This 7 years war had broken out in 1756 and had soon resulted in Britain allying with powers such as Prussia and Portugal, while France found allies in Austria and Spain, lending an international dimension to the conflict. However, by the time of George's accession in late 1760, British fortunes were on the ascendant, and peace was quickly secured in 1763 on favourable terms for Britain, which acquired New France, the future Canada, and France's trading posts along the Indian coastline. However, France would remain Britain's foremost rival for European hegemony throughout George's long life. In tandem to the war, the second issue confronting George was more personal. He needed a wife to secure the succession. George had been smitten by Lady Sarah Lennox in the late 1750s, but the marriage was not suitable from a dynastic perspective, and George was convinced by his family to marry Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz in September 1761. The couple met for the first time on their wedding day, but despite the inauspicious beginnings, the marriage proved very happy. George and Charlotte had 15 children during their long lives together, and he was never unfaithful. Beyond these initial concerns, as king, George's position as ruler of Britain was strong at the time of his accession. In the mid-18th century, the country was beginning to benefit enormously from a range of developments that would catapult the country to become the world's foremost military, economic, and political power by the 19th century. During the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, England had subsumed Scotland and Ireland, although religious divisions in Ireland remained a problem. Moreover, following a series of civil wars in the 17th century, England had emerged with a very strong political system where power was held between the monarchy, parliament, and nobility, unlike in countries such as France and Russia, where absolutist monarchs still held all the power and where a weak king or queen could result in prolonged periods of instability. Additionally, the British Navy had emerged as the foremost in the world during the 18th century. Finally, modern capitalism and proto-industry had emerged in England and the Low Countries during the 17th century, and London was emerging as a global capital of finance and trade at the heart of a growing British Empire, which held possessions in North America, the Caribbean, and India. And so one thing was clear: George would not rule over a weak nation. What Britain did have, however, was a divided parliament. Unlike in most European countries at the time, where domestic political tensions generally existed between the monarchy and aristocracy on one side, and the gentry and the bourgeois merchant and professional classes on the other, wanting more political power, in England, the power of the monarchy and nobility had already been considerably reduced during the civil wars of the 17th century. As a result, Parliament had emerged as the main organ of government in England, although the king and nobility were still very influential. But England had also been one of the first countries in the world where political parties representing differing societal viewpoints emerged, and this created considerable political problems at times during George's reign. In 18th century Britain, these included the Whigs, the forerunners of the modern-day Liberals, and the Tories, the predecessors of the British Conservative Party. Generally, the Whigs tended to seek a stronger parliament that benefited the merchant class in Britain, while the Tories were a more conservative party, comprised of many nobles, and were generally, though not always, the party more favourable to the monarchy. This duel between the Whigs and the Tories would shape how George III involved himself in Britain's politics. As early as the 1760s, George's role in Parliament was clearly felt. In 1762, a new Tory government came to power headed by John A. Stuart, 3rd Earl of Bute, a prominent Scottish lord and family friend of the royals. It was even rumoured that Bute was in a relationship with George's widowed mother, and there was consternation within the Whig establishment that this early sign of George's willingness to intervene in parliamentary affairs might signal that the new king wished to exercise greater power than his grandfather. As such, much of Britain's domestic politics in the 1760s was unstable, as the Whigs won a majority in Parliament, but a government cabinet could not be found that would last long, until such time as William Pitt the Elder agreed to form a cabinet. In 1766, Pitt was one of a handful of politicians who were central to running British state affairs during George's reign, and who must be mentioned in any consideration of the era. He dominated state affairs for much of the 1760s, before the Tory peer, Lord North, served as Prime Minister between 1770 and 1782. Finally, Pitt the Elder's son and namesake, William Pitt the Younger, dominated British politics in the 1780s and 1790s. These three men are critical to the assessment of George's long kingship. Pitt's heyday, however, it must be said, had passed by the late 1760s. His career had peaked during the late 1750s in the final years of George II's reign and the early 1760s, just as George III was settling into being addressed as the king. It was Pitt's passionate belief in Britain's imperial destiny that had led him to invest so much in the 7 Years' War against France, during which he served as Prime Minister of Great Britain. The instability of the 1760s was less grand, and Pitt suffered from increasingly poor health himself. Thus, in 1768, he tendered his resignation, citing the continued influence of the Earl of Bute and the king's meddling in Parliament as his motives for walking away. Consequently, George, who was having family problems at the time relating to what he perceived as improper conduct amongst his siblings, settled on a more pliable candidate in the shape of Frederick North, Lord North. It would be a fateful appointment, and North's tenure as Prime Minister over the next 12 years, along with George's steady backing of him, has been controversial ever since. This is above all because North's ascendancy occurred at the same time as the outbreak of major unrest within Britain's colonies in North America, and the eventual outbreak of a war of independence there. Ultimately, although he ruled as king, for 60 years, George III has become most famous for the rebellion which began in the British colonies on the eastern seaboard of North America during the 1770s, and which eventually resulted in the United States declaring their independence from Britain. British involvement in the region can be traced all the way back to the early 17th century. In 1607, the first permanent colony was settled at Jamestown in Virginia. After a stuttering start, by the 1620s, it became a secure plantation based on tobacco and cotton farming. Further to the north, the first British settlers arrived in New England in 1620, and 10 years later, new arrivals fleeing religious persecution in England began settling the town of Boston. In the decades that followed, these two colonies expanded outwards into new settlements at Rhode Island and Connecticut in the case of New England, and the Carolinas in the case of Virginia. Additional colonies were settled at Baltimore in what became the state of Maryland, and a Quaker colony under their leader, William Penn, was set up in what became Pennsylvania. With the conquest of the Dutch colony of New Holland and the renaming of New Amsterdam as New York, the British had secured virtually all the land from New England south to Georgia by the end of the 17th century. Yet the 13 colonies, as they were increasingly referred to by the time of George III's reign, were also increasingly difficult to rule over. At the heart of the matter was the lack of representation afforded to the American colonies in British political affairs. The 13 colonies had been settled by British people who believed that if they paid taxes to the Crown and to the British government, just as people in London, Bristol and Manchester in England did, then they should have representation in Parliament commensurate with paying their taxes. To compound the problem, the American colonies had become more and more wealthy in the course of the 18th century, as proto-industry flourished in cities like Philadelphia and Boston, and large taxes were generated by the slave plantations of sugar, cotton, and tobacco in the southern colonies. As the government in London sought to acquire greater control over these rich economies, local powers were stripped away from the colonies, and large taxes such as the Stamp Act of 1765 were imposed. The latter tax saw resistance movements being organized within the colonies against what was deemed to be British overreach. Trouble was brewing, and it would soon boil over and lead to war. The 1770s would eventually see the colonial communities of the American colonies rebel against British rule. By this time, there were approximately 2.5 million people living in the 13 colonies, as opposed to 8 million in England. This gives a sense of how large the tax base of the colonies was to the British Exchequer. The Stamp Act had already seen outbreaks of violence against government officials in the late 1760s, but these were eclipsed in 1773, when North's government in Britain passed the Tea Act. This was intended to facilitate the British East India Company, which had huge stockpiles of tea in its warehouses in London, in selling its products in the American colonies, where the market was generally dominated by smuggled tea rather than tea, which was imported through legal channels and on which taxes would have to be paid following the legislation of the 1760s. The colonial community perceived this as a further act of provocation. Tensions flared, most famously in the city of Boston, where on the 16th of December 1773, political protesters attacked ships of the British East India Company and dumped large consignments of tea into Boston Harbor. A British customs officer was also tarred and feathered by the rioters. It was a sign of how severe tensions had become. As news reached England of what had become known as the Boston Tea Party, George and the government of Lord North responded by passing the Boston Port Act in March 1774, which closed the port of Boston to all ships, even those operating legally, thus punishing the inhabitants of the town financially for their transgressions. But the incident had initiated a sequence of events which could not now easily be stopped. In reaction to the government's response, in North America, the colonies now sent representatives to a newly formed parliament of their own. The First Continental Congress met at Philadelphia in the autumn of 1774 and sent a petition to George directly calling for a repeal of the acts which had been issued by North's government in London in response to events in Boston. But this message had barely arrived in England, and a response formulated and returned before tensions were spilling over into direct military conflict between supporters of the Continental Congress and British troops stationed in North America. The first acts of the American Revolutionary War, or the American War of Independence, are typically understood to have played out at the battles of Lexington and Concord on the 19th of April 1775 near Massachusetts Bay. 8 further years of war would follow. George's role in fomenting the political crisis which led to the unrest in the colonies, and then deepening it in the aftermath of the Boston Tea Party, has been a subject of immense debate over the years. His reputation has generally fared poorly as a result, but the issue is very much a partisan one of the time. In America, the king was derided from the very inception of the war by individuals who wanted to drum up support for the revolutionary struggle. In a pamphlet which the political theorist Thomas Paine wrote in 1775 and published in the first days of 1776, entitled Common Sense, he argued in favor of the colonies acquiring independence from Great Britain. In it, Paine referred to George as the royal brute. The Declaration of Independence, which followed later in 1776, largely from the pen of Thomas Jefferson, conspiratorially and baselessly suggested that George had a plan to enslave his American subjects. Both documents are not exactly obscure. If the sales of Common Sense are measured proportionate to the actual population of the 13 colonies in 1776, then Paine's pamphlet is the best-selling book in American history, while the Declaration of Independence is one of the most significant, and widely cited political statements ever written. It is hard to imagine how any one individual's reputation could suffer more than by being impugned in these documents. The reality, though, of George III's role in initiating the Revolutionary War in America is more complex. When he ascended to the throne in 1760, he inherited an already declining situation there, where the colonial community was disgruntled with the cost in manpower and resources which they had to pay for the 7 Years' War against France. Conversely, George maintained a temperate stance throughout much of the mid-1770s while the crisis was escalating. In a speech to Parliament in England in October 1775, he stated his belief that much of the colonial community might have wished to remain loyal to the British government, and that he believed the unrest to be the actions of a violent minority, living in a time when governments did not have the information available to them, which modern-day administrations do. This was a reasonable belief, one which was added to by the fact that it took weeks to communicate accurate information back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean. More strikingly, in September 1775, George claimed of his own response to the outbreak of the war that he had been, quote, anxious to prevent, if it had been possible, the effusion of the blood of my subjects. George would make mistakes in relation to managing the American crisis, but he was no simple tyrant acting to augment his own royal power. Whatever George's role in creating the conflict, the result was inevitable by 1776. By that time, the Second Continental Congress had ordered one of its leading members, George Washington, a veteran of the British War in the 1750s, to form a new Continental Army to fight an all-out war of independence against British rule. Then, on the 4th of July 1776, the Congress in Philadelphia issued the Declaration of Independence, in which British rule of the 13 colonies was renounced. Even so, at this early stage, there were hopes in England that a quick settlement could be reached by appealing to more moderate elements amongst the colonial community. However, such beliefs were undermined quickly when the Continental Army succeeded in taking Boston, before a British counterattack led to the seizure of New York City in 1777. These exchanges in New England and south towards New York culminated in October 1777, when a numerically superior revolutionary army led by Benedict Arnold overcame a smaller force of British, Canadian, and German troops led by General John Burgoyne at the Battle of Saratoga in New York State. Thousands of British troops were captured, and as the war now expanded, France allied with the Continental Congress against Britain early in 1778. The war which followed dragged on for another 3 years. Like the 7 Years' War, which had preceded it nearly 20 years earlier, it took on an international dimension with French and then Spanish entry on the side of the American revolutionaries, and fighting occurring as far west as Louisiana and north into Canada. However, the main theatre remained the 13 colonies. By the early 1780s, much of this focused on the Chesapeake region, where Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis had been entrusted by the King and Lord North's government with overseeing military activities in the Carolinas and Virginia, where it was believed the general population was more inclined to loyalty to the British Crown and government. This tactic ultimately failed, and after Cornwallis made his last stand at the Siege of Yorktown in October 1781, the British military campaign in the colonies and the war was effectively over. 2 years later, in 1783, members of the Continental Congress and George III's government agreed to the Treaty of Paris in the French capital, whereby Great Britain acknowledged the existence of an independent United States of America, and the border between the new nation and Britain's territories, in what would one day become Canada, was established. While the outcome of the American Revolutionary War was a bitter blow to George, one which he frequently mentioned in later years, his reign was otherwise one of profound growth and expansion of the British Empire. British victory over France in the 7 Years' War in 1763 left Britain as the dominant colonial power in New France and in India. Thus, even before the United States was lost, Canada had been acquired. In India, only small pockets of land were held on the coastline by the early 1760s, but in a series of incredible conquests over the next 3 decades, much of the subcontinent around Bengal and Calicut, and then further inland towards Delhi, was brought under British rule by colonial adventurers such as Sir Robert Clive. Elsewhere, the British Royal Navy became the major power on the world's seas. By the 1770s, This extended to being able to defend British settlements as far away as the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic. Then, in a series of voyages which he made in the 1760s and 1770s, Captain James Cook discovered many of the Pacific islands such as Hawaii, before charting the coast of much of Australia. As a result, beginning with the First Fleet in 1787, Britain began sending settlers to New South Wales in the first acts of what would become British colonisation of Australia and New Zealand. Thus, George's reign was the first during which the maxim that the sun never set on the British Empire became substantially true. While the expansion of Britain's empire and its increasing dominance of the world's seas might have reflected well on George's reign, there was nevertheless a growing problem at home, and more specifically with the king himself. George was a deeply religious person and a devoted family man who also had a healthy lifestyle, being abstemious in his diet and exercising regularly. Yet, as early as the 1760s, there were reports of him acting in a slightly peculiar fashion at times, often becoming highly agitated and talking in an incessant fashion in ways which seemed out of character to those who knew him in a personal or professional capacity. Now, the mid-1780s would see him act in ways which for the first time led both George himself and many individuals in government to question whether the king could actually be trusted to rule. His malady, which has been euphemistically referred to as the madness of King George III, might possibly have been brought about by porphyria, a disease of the liver which can lead to mental illnesses when toxins build up in the system. Reports that George had purple urine at times would seem to substantiate this diagnosis, but others have suggested alternative psychological disorders, the most recent being that George had several bouts of increasingly severe and finally chronic mania. We will almost certainly never know for certain what caused George's alleged madness. What is clear, though, is that in 1788, the king entered into a period of sustained ill health, which for the first time resulted in a genuine crisis within the British state. This was a largely unprecedented situation in Britain at that time. George would often talk incessantly for hours, write sentences which ran to hundreds of words, and in his worst moments, he was confused, unsteady on his feet, foamed at the mouth, and was occasionally violent. A trip to Cheltenham Spa relieved his symptoms somewhat, but there were plans already being considered at this early stage for George's son, namesake, and heir, the future King George IV, to head a regency government if his father remained incapacitated. In the end, recourse to this drastic solution was not needed in the late 1780s, as George appeared to recover his health almost fully over the space of some months. But concerns remained, and in the end, George would enter a period of final illness in the early 19th century from which he would never recover. All of that, however, lay ahead, and in the late 1780s, further war loomed. The end of the American Revolutionary War did not bring an end to periods of prolonged warfare for Britain during George's long 60-year reign. In fact, just a few short years after the end of the conflict with the 13 colonies, fresh political strife within the country, which had proved the stalwart ally of the colonials, France, brought renewed upheaval. In 1789, a popular revolt began in France against the absolutist rule of King Louis XVI. Within weeks of calling a parliament, the king lost control of the situation, and eventually the government was taken over by the French parliament in the summer of 1789. By the end of that year, the king and queen were effectively being detained in Paris. The French Revolution would soon become more radical, and eventually a republic was declared in 1792, followed by the execution of Louis and his queen, Marie Antoinette, an act which George denounced as the work of savages. Worried by these radical new developments in France, the European powers, led by Britain and Austria, were soon at war with France in what would become known as the French Revolutionary Wars. In one shape or another, the conflict would drag on between Britain and France for the next 23 years. George's government would be dominated on the political stage throughout the period of the French Revolutionary Wars by William Pitt the Younger. Born in 1759, Pitt was the son of William Pitt the Elder, who had played such a prominent role in the government of Great Britain during the last days of George II's reign and the first decade of George III's own reign. He steered a middle-of-the-road course in politics, often being described as both an independent Whig and then a new Tory. Based on his abilities as an excellent administrator and, to some extent, the reputation of his father preceding him, Pitt was asked to become Prime Minister in 1783, shortly after Lord North's long government had ended when he was just 24 years of age. He would serve as head of George's government for the next 18 years. Throughout this period, he remained stalwart in his opposition to the French in defence of British interests and worked to increase efficiencies within Great Britain and reform the government in order to improve the taxation base to fund what eventually turned into nearly a quarter of a century of war with the French. Nearly all agreed that Pitt was a figure who did not act in his own interest, applied himself with quiet brilliance, and was one of Britain's greatest statesmen. In placing his faith in him for nearly 20 years, George made a wise decision after his questionable support for Lord North during the previous period. The initial struggles with France are known as the French Revolutionary Wars, to distinguish them from the later wars with what would become the French Empire. There were two major parts to this early conflict. The War of the First Coalition broke out in 1792, when France went to war with an alliance of Austria and Prussia, who were then joined by Great Britain and the Dutch Republic, and then a number of smaller powers such as Spain, Portugal, and Naples. This war would last for 5 years, during which time France's internal politics were highly turbulent, but during which it also won immense victories on the battlefield, owing to the use of the levée en masse, a form of national military conscription, which drastically increased the Republic's fighting abilities. When the war largely ended in 1797, the French had conquered the Low Countries from Austria and the Dutch Republic, the rump of which was formed into what was known as the Batavian Republic. The French had also conquered much of Western Germany, leaving them in possession of everything on the west bank of the River Rhine. Advances had also been made in northern Italy, where a brilliant young general from the island of Corsica named Napoleon Bonaparte had won several major victories against the Austrians. The War of the First Coalition was considered to have ended in 1797, when most of France's major enemies, including Austria and Prussia, had made separate peace agreements with the French. However, the British did not, and fought on, while for his part, George would never consider any peace with France as anything other than a temporary measure until the Republic, and what followed it was defeated. Thus, Britain was the driving force behind the formation of a new coalition in 1798 and the outbreak of the War of the Second Coalition that year. They were joined in this by Austria, the Ottoman Empire, Naples, and Portugal, and briefly other powers such as Russia and the United States. It began with a spectacular but ultimately unsuccessful invasion of Egypt by a French army led by Bonaparte. Several years of fighting followed thereafter until 1802, during which France's internal politics was again shifting dramatically, with the Republic drifting increasingly to a military dictatorship, one where power was gradually centralized in Bonaparte's hands as first consul of the country. When the war ended in 1802, France was not only confirmed in its possession of Western Germany, but it had increased its hold on Italy with the conquest of Tuscany. Europe now enjoyed a period of peace for just over 1 year. As a result of his ascendancy, and having confirmed France as the new predominant power on the continent, Bonaparte was able to move to bring the French Republic to an end in 1804, and had himself proclaimed as Emperor Napoleon I of France. Henceforth, he, rather than the French Republic, was perceived as the enemy by George and the British. It was in the midst of the French Revolutionary Wars that George, as king, and Pitt, as Prime Minister, had to deal with the greatest internal threat to Britain and Ireland that had been seen since the Jacobite rebellion in Scotland of 1745, and that would not be seen again until the outbreak of the Irish War of Independence in 1919. It occurred in Ireland. While Scotland and Wales had been generally reconciled to English political dominance of Britain between the 15th and 18th centuries, Ireland had remained a problem, one which was largely, though not exclusively, manifested in the continuing adherence of the majority of the population there to Roman Catholicism. Several rebellions there between the 1590s and 1690s had seen the island nearly lost, but a series of brutally repressive penal laws issued by the Protestant-dominated Irish Parliament, aimed against Catholics and Scottish Presbyterians, had crushed political opposition for much of the 18th century, though agrarian violence and unrest was rife at times between the 1760s and the 1780s. The war with France now provided an opportunity for a more concerted revolt there, and in 1798, such a rebellion was launched by the Society of United Irishmen, a Republican revolutionary group which had support from France. The rebellion of 1798 saw risings from within Ireland at Wexford in the southeast as well as other sites. A French expeditionary force then landed in the west, in County Mayo. However, a larger second French force was prevented from landing in Ulster in the north by the Royal Navy. This proved crucial, and in the 2 weeks that followed, some 30,000 British troops and thousands more irregular militia troops succeeded in suppressing the rebellion before Ireland could be turned into a launching pad for the French to attack Britain. It was a close shave, and one which the British government was determined not to repeat. Thus, a resolution was quickly made in the aftermath of the rebellion that Irish discontent would be appeased by repealing the penal laws there, including the right of Catholics to sit in Parliament. However, in tandem, it was determined that in order to avoid Irish Catholics forming a majority in the Irish Parliament, it would be dispensed with entirely. In January 1801, an Act of Union was passed, whereby the Irish Parliament was ended. Henceforth, MPs from Ireland would sit at Westminster, where the Catholic vote would be rendered powerless. George was granted the new title of King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, having declined an offer to be thereafter known as the Emperor of the British Isles. An Irish Parliament would not be convened again for over a century. Thus, the 1798 rebellion and the Act of Union which followed it quietened the Irish question for several generations. George and the British Parliament needed the Irish question at least temporarily solved in order to shore the country up against further French encroachments. After a brief period of peace in 1802 and early 1803, the War of the Third Coalition began when Britain declared war on France in May 1803. They were soon allied with Austria, Russia, Naples, Sicily, and Sweden in what was the strongest coalition France had yet faced. But even so, Napoleon carried all before him, culminating in a crushing victory against Austria and Russia at the Battle of Austerlitz in December 1805. As the Third Coalition broke up in 1806, France had now added Naples to its possessions and effectively broken Austrian control over much of Germany. A further swift war followed within months, during which Napoleon resoundingly defeated Prussia and seized half of its territory, out of much of which the Duchy of Warsaw, a Polish client state of France, was formed. Finally, with Napoleon's decision in 1808 to install his brother Joseph as King of Spain, a country which had been allied with France, but which at times had shown wavering loyalty, Napoleon Bonaparte was effectively ruler of an empire which stretched across Western Europe east through Central Europe as far as the borders with Tsarist Russia. In 1809, Bonaparte's iron-tight control over Europe was made clear when an Austrian attempt to resist French control of Central Europe was quickly defeated. His only perennial enemy remained George's Great Britain. However, there were cracks in Napoleon's dominance of the continent. Britain was unquestionably the foremost naval power in the world, and the destruction of much of France's fleet at the Battle of Trafalgar off the coast of Spain in 1805 had ensured that a land invasion of Britain could not now be undertaken by the French. Moreover, efforts by Napoleon from late 1806 to bring the British to their knees by imposing a massive blockade on trade between Great Britain and continental Europe proved largely ineffective. Indeed, the so-called continental system succeeded only in souring relations between Napoleon and Emperor Alexander I of Russia, as Russia remained the back door for British trade with the continent. These developments, combined with a front being opened by the British against France in Spain in 1807, one which would cost Napoleon dearly in troops and resources in the years that followed, ensured that Britain kept the fight against the French alive in what would ultimately prove to be the last years that George was lucid enough to rule as king in his own right. It would be unfair to suggest that George's reign was characterized simply by the wars which Britain fought during it. While it is understandable to take that view, given that during the 4 decades between 1776 and 1815, Britain was nearly constantly involved in major conflicts with the United States and France, George's reign and his kingship must be viewed as having contributed much more besides. For instance, this was the period in which the Industrial Revolution began in Britain, eventually changing the face of the entire world beyond recognition. Just 4 years after George's accession, the spinning jenny, a multi-spindle spinning machine, was invented in Blackburn. Soon, textile factories containing these new mass production devices were appearing across northern England, and they were soon to be powered by engines. Additionally, while coal and other fuels such as charcoal had been used in increasing amounts in England since the 16th century to power proto-industrial activities such as iron production, from the 1780s they were being used to power steam engines, which had been refined in a design James Watt introduced in 1781. Meanwhile, new, more efficient ploughs and land drainage methods, as well as better farming practices such as crop and field rotation and selective breeding of livestock, saw agricultural output expand considerably across Britain. Because of his strong interest in agricultural innovation, George gained the nickname Farmer George. It was not simply that Britain was becoming a centre of economic activity at this time. The innovation which was being seen in the textile industry, agriculture, and smelting practices extended to all manner of things, including medicine, mechanics, and engineering. For George, who had an interest in astronomy and clocks, things like this were of personal value, and ones which the royal family actively patronised throughout his reign. An instructive example of this was seen in the case of vaccines. In the 1790s, a British physician by the name of Edward Jenner began working on ways to inoculate people against smallpox, an appalling virus which killed and disfigured its many victims, of which there were 400,000 every year in 18th century Europe. Jenner pioneered a method of preventing the worst effects of it by purposefully infecting people with a small amount of cowpox, a related though much weaker virus from which people quickly recovered, with the advantage of immunity from the more deadly smallpox. His innovation was the first effective European vaccine against a major disease such as smallpox. Jenner was soon being supported by the king, and in particular his wife, Queen Charlotte, and several of the royal children were inoculated using Jenner's methods. George also provided financial and political support for Jenner to popularize and spread his ideas in the months that followed. In this way, George was a great supporter of the medical revolution of modern times. The years of war with France also saw increasing calls for an abolition of the slave trade in Britain. During the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, over 10 million Africans were forced onto boats in Western Africa and transported to the Americas, where they were used as slave labor, primarily in the sugar plantations of the Caribbean and in Portuguese and Spanish-controlled South America. Several 100,000 of them had been brought to the American colonies to work the tobacco and cotton plantations in Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia in particular, while the British had also transported large numbers of slaves to their sugar colonies in Barbados and other British-held colonies in the Caribbean. But the slave trade had always had a considerable number of opponents in America and Britain, even as it enriched port towns such as Liverpool. Many of these abolitionists originated from within religious groups such as the Quakers, who subsequently led efforts to abolish the slave trade in the 18th century. As a pious Christian, George favored abolitionism, and in the 1750s he is on record as saying that slavery was indefensible and entirely unethical. He would often support moves towards abolishing the slave trade during his reign. The abolitionist movement gained momentum throughout George's reign. In 1772, what was known as Somerset's case was heard before the King's Bench in London to adjudicate on the case of a fugitive slave in Jamaica who had previously lived in England. The trial concluded that there was no legal basis for slavery under English common law. With this legal precedent established, abolitionist groups led by figures such as William Wilberforce, Granville Sharp, and Hannah More began building public pressure to bring about an end to the slave trade. This was compounded in 1777 when Vermont, a state which had opted not to join the United States in the first years following independence, abolished slavery, while in 1794 the French Revolutionary government abolished slavery throughout its overseas territories, following which the French colony of Saint-Dominique in the Caribbean emerged as the first former colony ruled by former slaves. When the northern states in the US, such as Massachusetts and New York, abolished slavery in their jurisdictions in the 1800s, the argument in favor of abolishing the slave trade in Britain became overwhelming. Finally, in 1807, the Slave Trade Act was signed into law by George. It was a victory for a monarch who had called the institution repugnant. However, the 1807 Act only prohibited the transport of slaves from Africa on British ships. The abolitionists would have to wait until 1833 for the Slavery Abolition Act to effectively prohibit the entire institution of slavery throughout the British Empire. George III also made a significant contribution to the cultural and intellectual life of Great Britain, and England in particular. The British Museum had been created in 1753 during the later years of his grandfather's reign, and George was committed to adding to the library, which is the forerunner of the British Library of today. Therefore, George assembled what, by one estimation, was deemed to be one of the finest libraries ever created by one man. He was advised in the process by such literary luminaries as Samuel Johnson. This personal collection consisted of 65,250 volumes, as well as approximately 19,000 tracts and pamphlets, and the largest collection of British maps and charts ever assembled up to that point. The scope of the collections was vast, with a particular focus on history. Particularly noteworthy works included copies of William Caxton's edition of Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, a Gutenberg Bible, and 4 copies of William Shakespeare's first folio of collected works. Following his death, in honour of his earlier stated wishes, George's incredible personal library was offered to the nation and was finally accepted into the British Museum as the King's Library. Today, the glass see-through tower, which houses George's vast collection, makes up the central display that dominates the impressive foyer of the British Library in London. George was also a significant patron and collector of art, as well as being a competent architectural draftsman himself. In 1762, he purchased a large collection of Italian works from Joseph Smith, the British consul in Venice at the time, and these works were brought to Buckingham House in London. George also commissioned portraits and other original works from some of the most famous artists of the day, notably by Thomas Gainsborough, regarded by some as the greatest British artist of the second half of the 18th century, and one who painted several portraits of the royal family. Further artists whom he and the royal family patronised during his reign include Alan Ramsay and Sir Thomas Lawrence. George also played a significant role in ensuring that the Royal Academy of Arts was established in 1768, providing it with vital initial funds and accommodation at Old Somerset House and other locations in its early days. Although he was often perceived as being interfering in the art world, there is no doubt that George was an enlightened and generous benefactor of both learning and artistic work in Great Britain during the second half of the 18th century, and the British Enlightenment owed much to him. The war with France continued to trundle on through the late 18th century. Napoleon remained firmly in control of much of Europe, but the British were beginning to cause the French major trouble in the Iberian Peninsula, where an invasion was launched in 1807. Under the command of Arthur Wellesley, who became the first Duke of Wellington, the Peninsular War became known as the Spanish Ulcer. Such was its drain on French resources. Then, in 1812, Napoleon launched an ill-judged invasion of Tsarist Russia, where his armies were largely destroyed in the harsh Russian winter. It was the beginning of the end, and during the course of 1813 and 1814, the Russians, and then the Prussians and Austrians, began rolling back all of Bonaparte's conquests of the previous 15 years across Eastern and Central Europe. Yet George would not be in an appropriate state of mind by the mid-1810s to be able to celebrate the victory after over 20 years of war with the French. In the late 1700s, his relationship with his son and heir, the Prince of Wales, the future George IV, had deteriorated, compounded by rumours that the Princess of Wales had given birth to an illegitimate child several years earlier. A commission of investigation determined that the rumours were false, but did remark that Princess Caroline's general conduct in recent years had encouraged such unfavourable allegations. This, compounded by charges in Parliament in 1809 that the King's favourite son, the Duke of York, had been guilty of selling military commissions, along with a serious health development for his youngest and favourite daughter, the Princess Amelia, was the context in which George's mental health yet again deteriorated. Then, in 1810, Amelia's health worsened further, and another son was involved in a scandal involving a valet of his being found dead. Just weeks later, George entered his final bout of madness. It would last 10 years. His last public appearance was at Windsor Castle on the 25th of October 1810, where his Golden Jubilee was marked. Yet what should have been a celebration of George's 50th year on the throne was overshadowed by the fact that Amelia was at death's door and would die only a week later. The king was clearly not okay, appearing manic and flustered. Rumours circulated that his former symptoms had returned at their most severe level since the crisis of 1788, and now they were worse than ever. Living in an age when little was known about what caused such psychological illnesses, and with virtually no effective treatments available, George was confined to a straitjacket within days. His care improved somewhat over time, but George clearly could not continue to act as king. The royal family and the political nation now needed to act in what was a relatively unprecedented crisis. When monarchs had become psychologically incapacitated in past times, such as had happened with King Henry VI in the mid-15th century, rivals usually used the opportunity to initiate a civil war to press their own claim. That was out of the question by the early 19th century. Instead, an Act of Parliament was passed on the 7th of February 1811, whereby a regency government was established, with George's son and heir, the future George IV, acting as regent until such time as his father should either recover or die. The king's care was entrusted to his wife, Queen Charlotte, and a small council headed by the Archbishop of Canterbury, to ensure that George's person would not become a political football for competing interests within the regency government. Speedy recovery was initially hoped for, as many attributed this latest bout of psychological ill health to the king's concerns for Amelia. However, as the weeks went by, it was clear that George's condition was actually deteriorating rather than improving. Consequently, during the last 10 years of his reign, the king played no role in public life, such that the 1810s are typically referred to as the Regency period, though George III cannot be said to have been King of Great Britain during the Regency period. These years did bring closure to the political events which had dominated his reign in the 1790s and 1800s. Napoleon was finally defeated after his disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812 by the Sixth Coalition, which had been assembled in the spring of 1813, when an army of nearly 200,000 men under his command was defeated by a largely Russian, Austrian, and Prussian army of over 360,000 troops at Leipzig in Germany in mid-October 1813. It was clear that Napoleon Bonaparte's days were numbered. France was invaded in 1814, and he was forced to abdicate. Despite a brief re-seizure of power in France the following year, after defeat at the famous Battle of Waterloo in June 1815, Napoleon was exiled to the Atlantic island of St. Helena, where he died in 1821. At the Congress of Vienna, which brought the Napoleonic Wars to an end, the French monarchy was restored. Britain's main allies on the continent, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, gained lands in Italy, Germany, and Poland, but Britain's gains came in the form of colonies, notably the Cape Colony in South Africa, which the British had conquered from France's Dutch ally during the war, Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, off the coast of India, and Malta, which had also been occupied by the British during the course of the war. Sadly, the last 9 or so years of King George III's life were spent in a twilight world, one in which he was almost completely unaware of what was happening around him. To compound matters, the king, who was already approaching his mid-70s, at the onset of his final illness in 1810, suffered from deteriorating physical health as well. His eyesight declined until he eventually became blind, and he was also very hard of hearing as the months and years went by. Those who loved him tried to provide him with good care, but no medical treatment was available for his condition at the time, and it was believed that the best course of action was to try to reduce the stimuli that would exacerbate his conditions. This included restricting visitors, and George spent his last years largely alone, having conversations with individuals from his past who were long dead. Ever a musician, he continued, despite his increasing deafness, to try to play some music on a harpsichord which had once been owned by the great composer George Friedrich Handel, whom he had been a prominent patron of. George III died at Windsor on the 29th of January 1820 and was buried at St. George's Chapel over 2 weeks later. At the time, he was the longest-serving monarch England or Great Britain had ever seen. Great Britain continued to flourish in the aftermath of George's long reign. Following his father's death in 1820, his son finally ascended as king in his own right as George IV, though it was George III's granddaughter Victoria who became synonymous with 19th century Britain and the empire at the height of its global power. Her reign would last longer even than that of her grandfather, beginning in 1837 and ending in 1901. During the Victorian period, the British Empire stretched from Australia and New Zealand through India, much of Africa, Britain and Ireland, and west to Canada and the Caribbean. The British economy was the largest in the world for much of the Victorian age, and the country's navy guaranteed that the nation was the strongest military power globally as well. Before America became the policeman of the world in the 20th century, Britain occupied that role in the 19th century and presided over a period where the European powers avoided an all-out conflict between the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 and the outbreak of the First World War a century later. Much of the seeds of Britain's status as a superpower and the Pax Britannica, the great peace which it oversaw, were sown during George III's reign. George III quickly became one of the most controversial monarchs in British history. Many of these interpretations were very negative. For liberals, he was a monarch who interfered too much with Parliament. For Catholics, his actions in Ireland were deemed duplicitous. And for Americans, George soon became the tyrannous oppressor of the colonies. These views persisted for decades, and several prominent Victorian historians suggested that George intruded too much into the politics of the country, while as late as 1937, it was even suggested that he had attempted to foist a dictatorship on Britain. All of these views are partisan and skewed. The problems in the relationship with the American colonies existed well before George became king, and thereafter, their conflict was largely with the British Parliament. The Irish question dated in one form or another back to the late Middle Ages, and George can hardly be blamed for following the example which had been provided by Scotland a century earlier, of abating some of Ireland's problems by getting rid of its parliament. Finally, the suggestion that George III was an autocratic king in an age which included King Louis XV of France and Emperor Alexander the Fair of Russia is fanciful. George was not a tyrant, and his reputation has accordingly been revised in recent times to present him more favourably, most recently in a biography by Andrew Roberts. Part of the reason why George's reign is so striking, and why he has been judged so differently by different people and generations, was that his reign covered a period of such immense change. He succeeded in 1760, at a time when Watt's steam engine, Jenner's vaccine, and the telegraph were unheard of, and the US Declaration of Independence and the French Revolution were political events which lay ahead. All of these things either happened or were invented during George's time as king, and it was just a few years after he passed away that slavery was fully abolished throughout the British Empire, and the first steam-powered commercial train line began operating between Stockport and Darlington. So momentous was the period George III led Great Britain through that historians generally concur that in 1760 the world was in a period called the Early Modern Era, but by the time George died it had definitively crossed the threshold into full modernity. George III might not have been a perfect king, but in the face of a great degree of personal adversity, he managed to act as Britain's head of state with many substantial successes, during a period which by any stretch of the imagination presented considerable challenges. Perhaps he is best remembered as that, a man who did a decent job under trying circumstances, and that's the end of part one of our serene royal tale. From the shifting powers of George the Farm, the bravery of George II, to the trials and triumphs of George III, we've drifted through an era of enormous change. If this story brought you a bit of peace tonight, don't forget to like, comment your favourite monarch, and subscribe so you never miss a dreamy dive into history. Rest well, dear friend. May your sleep tonight be deep, your dreams gentle, and your heart calm. Good night from Sleepy Crown.